The gunshots cracked through the Montana twilight like thunder breaking against granite cliffs. Margaret Sullivan pressed her back against the kitchen window, her weathered hands gripping the Winchester rifle that had belonged to her late husband. Through the dusty glass, she watched shadows moving between her cattle, dark figures on horseback cutting through her herd with practiced efficiency. But what the rustlers didn't know was that among the cottonwood trees lining Willow Creek, another shadow waited, one that had been watching over the Triple S Ranch for longer than they could imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other on the Triple S Ranch, with Margaret Sullivan rising before dawn to tend to the daily routines that kept her small operation running. The coffee pot bubbled on the cast-iron stove as she pulled on her worn leather boots, the same ones she'd been wearing for the past 8 years since Thomas had passed. The ranch house, built from local timber and fieldstone, stood solid against the Montana wind, though it felt vastly empty now that she was its only occupant. Margaret had inherited more than just land when Thomas died. She'd inherited his debts, his dreams, and his stubborn determination to make something lasting from this harsh piece of earth. The Triple S sprawled across 1,200 acres of rolling grassland, bordered by Willow Creek to the north and the Burtooth Mountains rising like ancient sentinels to the west. It wasn't the largest spread in Yellowstone County, but it was theirs, and Margaret had fought tooth and nail to keep it. The cattle were scattered across the south pasture, about 60 head of mixed Angus and Hereford stock, not enough to make her wealthy, but sufficient to keep the ranch afloat if she managed them carefully. Each animal represented money in the bank, food on the table, and another year she could hold on to the life she and Thomas had built together. Losing even a handful would mean the difference between making it through winter and having to sell out to the larger ranches that seemed to swallow up small operations every season. She walked the fence line that morning, checking for breaks in the wire and loose posts. The autumn grass crunched beneath her feet, already touched by the first frost of the season. In the distance, the mountains wore caps of fresh snow, a reminder that winter would arrive soon whether she was ready or not. The cattle would need to be moved to the winter pasture closer to the barn, where she could more easily provide hay and shelter during the harsh months ahead. Margaret had learned to read the land, the way other people read books. Every subtle change in the grass, every shift in the wind, every movement of the animals told her something about the health of her ranch. This morning, however, something felt different. The cattle seemed restless, bunching together more than usual, their heads turning frequently toward the tree line. She'd noticed fresh horse tracks near the creek the day before, but had dismissed them as belonging to drifters passing through. Now, watching her animals' nervous behavior, she wondered if she'd been too quick to ignore the signs. The isolation of ranch life had never bothered her. When Thomas was alive, they'd been content with each other's company, finding joy in the simple rhythms of caring for their land and animals. But in the years since his death, the solitude had taken on a different character. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was vulnerable. A woman alone on a remote ranch was seen by some as an easy target, and Margaret knew there were men in the territory who wouldn't hesitate to take advantage of that perception. She'd heard stories from neighboring ranches about cattle disappearing in the night, about families waking to find their herds decimated by rustlers who struck fast and vanished into the wilderness. The territorial authorities were spread too thin to provide much protection, and most ranchers had learned to defend what was theirs or lose it. Margaret had the Winchester and knew how to use it, but she also understood that a rifle was only effective if you could see your enemies coming. The day wore on with the familiar cadence of ranch work. She repaired a section of fence damaged by wind, hauled water to the stock tank, and spent an hour working with a young colt that Thomas had started training before his death. The horse was finally beginning to accept the saddle, though he still shied away from her approach. Patience was required for everything on the ranch, from training horses to growing grass to building a life that could withstand the challenges of frontier existence. As afternoon faded toward evening, Margaret found herself looking more frequently toward the tree line that bordered her property. The feeling of being watched had grown stronger throughout the day, though she'd seen no concrete evidence of unwelcome visitors. She trusted her instincts, honed by years of reading the subtle signs that nature provided. Something was coming, and she needed to be prepared. She brought the cattle closer to the ranch house as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. The animals moved reluctantly, still skittish and alert to dangers she couldn't yet identify. By the time she'd secured them in the fenced pasture nearest the barn, the sky had taken on the deep purple hue that preceded full darkness. Stars were beginning to appear overhead, bright and cold in the clear mountain air. Margaret returned to the house and lit the oil lamps, their warm glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. She prepared a simple supper of cornbread and beans, but found herself eating without appetite, her attention focused on the sounds outside. The normal chorus of night creatures seemed muted, as if the very wildlife sensed a disturbance in the natural order. She cleaned the Winchester carefully, checking the action and counting her ammunition. 18 rounds in the rifle, plus another box of cartridges in the kitchen drawer. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but sufficient if she chose her shots wisely. The weight of the weapon in her hands was both comforting and sobering, a reminder of how far she was from any help should trouble arrive. The clock on the mantel chimed 9 times, its mechanical voice echoing in the empty house. Margaret had always found comfort in that sound when Thomas was alive, a marker of time shared and time remaining together. Now it served only to measure the hours of her solitude, each chime a reminder of how alone she truly was on this isolated piece of ground. She moved through the house, extinguishing lamps and checking the windows and doors. The routine was second nature after 8 years of living without a man's protection, but tonight she performed each task with extra care. The heavy wooden shutters were latched tight, the door barred with the thick oak beam that Thomas had installed during their first winter. From the outside, the house would appear dark and unoccupied, though she positioned herself near the kitchen window, where she could observe the pasture without being seen. The cattle were restless in their enclosure, moving in tight circles and lowing softly to each other. Their behavior confirmed what her instincts had been telling her all day. Trouble was approaching the Triple S Ranch, and she would face it alone, just as she'd faced every challenge since Thomas's death. But solitude had taught her strength, and she was prepared to defend what was hers, no matter the cost. The wind picked up as the night deepened, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the promise of an early winter. Margaret gripped the Winchester tighter, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond her windows, waiting for whatever dawn would bring to her small corner of the Montana frontier. The memory struck Margaret like lightning, splitting the darkness. 23 years had passed since that sweltering August afternoon when she'd first encountered Running Wolf beside Willow Creek. She'd been 17 then. Margaret O'Brien, fresh from Boston and utterly unprepared for frontier life. Her father had dragged the family west chasing stories of gold and opportunity, only to die of fever within 6 months of their arrival. Her mother had followed him to the grave before the first snow, leaving Margaret orphaned in a land that seemed determined to swallow anyone foolish enough to challenge its harsh beauty. That particular day, she'd been gathering wild berries along the creek bank, her basket half filled with the tart blackberries that would supplement their meager food stores. The August heat pressed down like a physical weight, and she'd knelt by the water's edge to splash the cool creek water on her face and neck. The cottonwood leaves rustled overhead, providing blessed shade from the relentless sun that seemed to bleach the color from everything it touched. She hadn't heard him approach. One moment she was alone beside the murmuring water, and the next, a young Cherokee man emerged from the trees as if he'd materialized from the shadows themselves. He couldn't have been more than 19, tall and lean with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His clothes were a mixture of traditional and adopted styles. Buckskin leggings beneath a cotton shirt, his long black hair braided with beaded leather ties. Margaret's first instinct had been fear. Every story she'd heard about Indians since arriving in the territory had been designed to terrify. Tales of raids and violence that painted all native peoples as savage enemies of civilization. But Running Wolf had simply stood there, making no threatening moves, his expression more curious than hostile. When he spoke, his English was clear and measured, tinged with an accent that somehow made the familiar words sound musical. "The berries are sweeter upstream," he'd said, pointing toward a bend in the creek where the water pooled in a natural basin. "The deer drink there at dawn and dusk, but they don't disturb the bushes during the day." She'd stared at him, uncertain whether to run or thank him. Her practical nature had won out, and she'd followed his direction to find the most abundant berry patch she'd ever seen. They'd worked in companionable silence for nearly an hour, filling her basket while he gathered plants she didn't recognize for what he explained were medicinal purposes. When they'd finished, he'd walked her halfway back to town, melting into the forest before they came within sight of the settlement. That chance encounter had blossomed into an unlikely friendship. Running Wolf belonged to a small band of Cherokee who'd managed to avoid the forced relocations that had driven most of his people from their ancestral lands. They lived quietly in the remote valleys of the Burtooth Range, hunting and gathering as their ancestors had, trading occasionally with friendly white settlers but mostly keeping to themselves. The young man had been educated at a mission school before choosing to return to the traditional ways, giving him a foot in both worlds that few others possessed. Their meetings had been irregular, but consistent over the years. Sometimes weeks would pass without contact, then Running Wolf would appear beside the creek or at the edge of the forest, bringing news of weather patterns, animal movements, or potential dangers in the area. He'd taught her which plants could heal and which could poison, how to read the subtle signs that predicted changes in weather, and most importantly, how to move through the wilderness without leaving obvious traces of her passage. The relationship had deepened when Margaret married Thomas Sullivan and they'd established the Triple S Ranch. Running Wolf had appeared at their wedding, uninvited, but not unwelcome, bringing a gift of a medicine bundle crafted from materials gathered throughout their territory. Thomas, a practical man with an open mind, had recognized the value of having a friend who knew the land better than any surveyor's map could detail. The Cherokee concept of blood brotherhood wasn't something taken lightly. It represented a bond deeper than friendship, a commitment that transcended cultural boundaries and personal convenience. The ceremony had taken place during Margaret's second winter on the ranch, when a late blizzard had trapped Running Wolf in their barn for 3 days. During those long hours waiting for the storm to pass, they'd shared stories of their childhoods, their losses, and their hopes for the future. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas had participated in the simple ritual, understanding that accepting Running Wolf as blood brother meant accepting responsibility for his welfare and trusting him with their own. They'd mixed their blood with creek water and earth from the ranch, speaking the words that bound them together as family chosen rather than born. From that moment forward, Running Wolf had been more than a friend or ally. He was kin, with all the obligations and protections that relationship entailed. After Thomas's death, Running Wolf had become Margaret's guardian angel, though she hadn't always been aware of his presence. He'd learned to move through the forest like smoke, appearing when needed and vanishing when his protection was no longer required. Sometimes she'd find evidence of his passing, tracks near her water source that warned of predators in the area, small cairns of stones that indicated safe paths through difficult terrain, or game trails that had been subtly altered to guide dear toward her hunting areas. The bond had grown stronger during her years of widowhood. Running Wolf understood the vulnerability of her position better than most. Knowing that a woman alone on a remote ranch faced dangers that went beyond the usual challenges of frontier life, he'd made it his mission to watch over the Triple S. Not out of pity or obligation, but from the genuine love and respect that had developed between them over more than 2 decades of friendship. Margaret had learned to read the signs of his presence. A particular arrangement of twigs near her doorstep meant he'd been checking the perimeter during the night. Stones placed in specific patterns warned of strangers in the area or weather changes that might affect her livestock. Once, she'd discovered fresh meat hanging in her smokehouse after a particularly difficult week when injury had prevented her from hunting. Though she'd never seen him make the delivery, their communication had evolved into an intricate language of signs and signals that allowed them to share information without direct contact. Margaret would leave messages of her own, using arrangements of common objects to indicate her status and any concerns she might have. A white cloth tied to the fence post meant all was well, while a red one indicated potential danger. The system had served them well over the years, providing comfort and security without drawing unwanted attention to their unusual relationship. The territorial authorities and neighboring ranchers knew that Margaret Sullivan seemed unusually well informed about conditions in the surrounding wilderness, but they attributed her knowledge to the practical wisdom that came from years of frontier living. None suspected that she had a Cherokee guardian watching over her interests, and Margaret saw no reason to enlighten them. The prejudices of the time made such friendships dangerous for both parties involved. Now, standing in her darkened kitchen with the Winchester in her hands, Margaret found herself wondering if Running Wolf was already aware of the approaching danger. The restless behavior of her cattle suggested that something significant was moving through the area, and she doubted such activity would escape his notice. If he was out there in the shadows, she took comfort in knowing that she wouldn't face whatever was coming entirely alone. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of horses moving through the trees. Margaret's grip tightened on her rifle as she peered through the gap in her shutters. The night was too dark to make out details, but movement in the forest confirmed what her instincts had been telling her all day. Riders were approaching the Triple S ranch, and their intentions were unlikely to be friendly. She thought of the medicine bundle that Running Wolf had given her so many years ago, still hanging above her bed where Thomas had placed it on their wedding night. The power it represented wasn't supernatural, but rather the strength that came from knowing someone cared enough to watch over her welfare. In the dangerous hours ahead, that knowledge might prove more valuable than any weapon she could carry. Sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Margaret prepared herself for the confrontation that had been building all day. But somewhere in the darkness beyond her windows, she knew that other eyes were watching, other hands were preparing to act, and the bond forged in blood and strengthened by decades of trust was about to be tested in ways neither she nor Running Wolf had ever imagined. The first horseman emerged from the tree line like a specter materializing from the depths of hell itself. Margaret pressed her eye closer to the gap between the shutters, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air as she watched the figure approach her pasture fence. The man sat his horse with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted, his hat pulled low over features she couldn't make out in the starlight dot behind him. More riders appeared from the forest, their movements coordinated with the precision of men who'd worked together before. Margaret counted 7 in total, each mounted on sturdy horses that looked capable of covering long distances quickly. These weren't desperate drifters hoping to steal a cow or two for food. This was a professional operation, the kind of organized, rustling gang that had been plaguing ranches throughout the territory for the past 2 years. The leader raised his hand, bringing the group to a halt just outside the fence line. Margaret could hear the soft creak of leather and the quiet snorting of horses, sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. The men spread out along the perimeter, positioning themselves to surround the pasture where her cattle were bunched together, their eyes reflecting the starlight like scattered diamonds. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the tactical nature of their deployment. These men knew exactly what they were doing, and they'd clearly scouted her property beforehand. They knew where the gates were located, which sections of fence could be quickly cut, and how many animals they were dealing with. This wasn't a spontaneous raid, but a carefully planned theft that had probably been weeks in the making. The leader dismounted and approached the fence, producing wire cutters from his saddlebags. The metallic snip of the tool biting through the fence wire sounded like gunshots in Margaret's ears. Each cut another step toward the destruction of everything she'd worked to build. Her cattle began to stir more restlessly, sensing the presence of strangers and the disruption of their normal environment. From her hidden position, Margaret could see enough of the leader's face to recognize him as Jake Hendricks, a name whispered with fear throughout the territory. Hendricks ran one of the most successful rustling operations in Montana, specializing in hitting isolated ranches where resistance would be minimal and escape routes plentiful. His gang was known for their efficiency and ruthlessness, taking what they wanted and leaving broken families in their wake. Hendricks was a big man, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that spoke of years spent wrestling cattle and breaking horses. His face bore the weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors, marked by a distinctive scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth. He wore his guns low on his hips, and the way he moved suggested he was comfortable using them when necessary. The other members of his gang were cut from similar cloth. Hard men who'd chosen the outlaw trail over honest work. They operated with the cold efficiency of predators who'd learned to read their prey's weaknesses. Margaret recognized the type from her years on the frontier: men who'd been broken by war, poverty, or circumstance, and had decided that taking from others was easier than building something of their own. As Hendricks worked on the fence, 2 of his men dismounted and began preparing to enter the pasture on foot. They moved with practiced stealth, staying low and avoiding sudden movements that might spook the cattle. Margaret understood their strategy. They would quietly separate a portion of the herd and drive them through the gap in the fence, where the mounted men would take control and guide them toward whatever hidden trail they'd planned for their escape. The financial impact of losing her cattle would be devastating. Those 60 head represented not just her livelihood for the coming year, but her ability to maintain the ranch itself. Without the income from selling beef in the spring, she wouldn't be able to pay the taxes on her land or purchase the supplies needed to make it through another winter. Hendricks and his men weren't just stealing her cattle, they were stealing her future, her independence, and her ability to honor the memory of the life she'd built with Thomas. Margaret shifted her position slightly, trying to get a better view of the activity in her pasture. The Winchester felt heavy in her hands, its familiar weight both comforting and inadequate against the odds she faced. 7 armed men against 1 woman, no matter how determined, represented impossible mathematics. Even if she managed to drop 1 or 2 with carefully aimed shots, the others would quickly locate her position and return fire with overwhelming force. The sound of her cattle, growing more agitated, filtered through the night air. The rustlers had succeeded in cutting through the fence and were now inside the pasture, working to separate a group of animals from the main herd. Their horses snorted and stamped as they maneuvered around the nervous cattle, and Margaret could hear the low voices of the men as they coordinated their movements. One of the mounted rustlers had positioned himself near the gate that led to the road, ready to guide the stolen cattle toward whatever route they'd planned for moving them to market. Margaret knew that once her animals left the ranch, she'd never see them again. The territorial authorities were understaffed and overworked, more concerned with maintaining order in the growing towns than chasing cattle thieves across hundreds of miles of wilderness. The injustice of the situation burned in Margaret's chest like acid. She'd worked herself to exhaustion for 8 years, sacrificing comfort and companionship to build something lasting on this harsh land. Every fence post had been set by her own hands, every sick animal nursed back to health through her dedication. Every decision made with careful consideration of what Thomas would have wanted. Now strangers were casually dismantling her life's work as if her sacrifice meant nothing. As she watched the Rustlers work, Margaret found herself thinking about the stories Running Wolf had told her about his people's struggles against those who would take their land and destroy their way of life. The Cherokee had faced displacement and persecution from those who saw their presence as an obstacle to progress and profit. Now she was experiencing a microcosm of that same injustice, watching as men with guns decided that her property was theirs for the taking. The leader, Hendricks, had moved closer to the house and was studying the darkened windows with professional interest. Margaret held her breath, wondering if he suspected that someone was inside watching his operation. After a long moment, he turned back to supervising his men, apparently satisfied that the ranch was unoccupied. His assumption made sense. Most people would have fled or hidden at the first sign of trouble, leaving their property undefended rather than risk a confrontation with armed rustlers. But Margaret Sullivan was not most people. 8 years of widowhood had taught her that retreat often meant permanent loss, that sometimes the only choice was to stand and fight, regardless of the odds. She'd faced down wolves threatening her livestock, fought through blizzards to rescue stranded cattle, and stared down drunken cowhands who thought a woman alone was fair game for harassment. She wasn't about to surrender her life's work without a fight. The practical side of her mind calculated angles and distances, trying to determine the best position from which to make her stand. The kitchen window offered a clear view of the pasture, but limited mobility if she needed to change positions quickly. The barn would provide better cover, but would require her to cross open ground under the watchful eyes of the mounted rustlers. Each option carried significant risks, and none offered anything approaching a guarantee of success. Margaret's finger found the trigger guard of the Winchester, and she tried to calm her breathing enough to ensure accurate shooting when the moment came. She'd learned marksmanship from Thomas, who'd insisted that anyone living on the frontier needed to be capable of defending themselves and their property. Her skill with the rifle was considerable, honed by years of hunting game and protecting livestock from predators. The rustlers had succeeded in separating about half her herd from the main group and were beginning to move them toward the cut fence. Margaret knew that once the cattle passed through that gap, her chances of stopping the theft would diminish rapidly. The time for action was approaching, whether she was ready or not. As she prepared to make her move, a shadow detached itself from the cottonwood trees near the creek. For just an instant, Margaret caught a glimpse of a familiar silhouette moving with the fluid grace she'd learned to recognize over 23 years of friendship. Running Wolf was indeed watching, and from his position, he had a clear view of the entire operation. The knowledge that she wasn't alone in this fight filled Margaret with a surge of confidence that surprised her with its intensity. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, she knew that someone who understood the value of what she was defending would be standing with her. The blood bond they'd forged years ago was about to be tested in the most dangerous way possible, and Margaret found herself trusting in that connection with a faith that transcended rational calculation. The sound of cattle moving through the cut fence reached her ears, and Margaret knew the moment for hesitation had passed. Hendricks and his gang had crossed the line from trespass to theft, and she would not allow them to destroy her future without paying a price for their crime. She raised the Winchester to her shoulder, sighted along the barrel, and prepared to announce her presence to the men who thought they could take whatever they wanted from a woman alone on the Montana frontier. Margaret's first shot shattered the night, silence like a clap of thunder rolling across the Montana plains. Winchester's report echoed off the barn walls and bounced between the cottonwood trees as the .44 to 40 cartridge found its mark in Jake Hendricks' left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the fence post he'd been standing beside. His cry of pain and surprise cut through the darkness, instantly transforming the organized cattle theft into chaos. The rustler nearest to Hendricks wheeled his horse around, trying to locate the source of the gunfire while simultaneously drawing his own weapon. Margaret had already worked the lever action and was lining up her second shot when the man's revolver cleared leather. She squeezed the trigger again, and this time her bullet caught him center mass, lifting him from his saddle and depositing him in a motionless heap beside the fence line. "Sniper in the house!" Hendricks roared, pressing his right hand against his wounded shoulder while trying to reach his pistol with the other. "Billy Tom, flank around back. Pete, get those cattle moving now." The remaining rustlers scattered like startled quail, their horses dancing and snorting as gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Margaret realized with a surge of fierce satisfaction that Running Wolf had opened fire from his position near the creek, his rifle speaking with the distinctive crack of a military Springfield. One of the mounted rustlers attempting to circle the house suddenly pitched forward over his horse's neck, a dark stain spreading across his shirt as he slumped in the saddle. Margaret ducked below the window sill as return fire began petering the front of the house. Splinters of wood flew from the window frame, and she heard the distinctive whine of bullets passing overhead. The rustlers were firing blind, trying to suppress whoever was shooting from the house while they repositioned for a coordinated assault. She crawled quickly to the other kitchen window, hoping to get a different angle on the attackers. From her new position, she could see two rustlers dismounting near the barn, using the large structure as cover while they planned their approach to the house. These men moved with military precision, suggesting they'd learned their tactics during the war that had ended 15 years ago. Many outlaws were former soldiers who'd found it difficult to return to civilian life, their skills with weapons and small unit tactics making them formidable adversaries for isolated ranchers. Running Wolf's rifle cracked again from the tree line, and one of the rustlers near the barn spun around, clutching his leg as he dropped behind a water trough. His partner immediately began laying down covering fire in the direction of the creek, his revolver flashing orange in the darkness as he tried to pin down the unseen Cherokee warrior. The muzzle flashes gave away his position, and Margaret took careful aim through her window before squeezing off another round. Her bullet struck the man in the torso, but he didn't go down immediately. Instead, he staggered backward, still firing wildly in her direction, his shots going wide but forcing her to duck for cover. When she looked up again, he had collapsed beside the barn wall, his weapon fallen silent. That left 4 rustlers still capable of fighting, plus Hendricks, who was wounded but far from out of the battle. The cattle were now in full panic, their lowing and stamping adding to the cacophony of gunfire that filled the night air. Several head had already pushed through the cut fence and were scattering into the forest, while others milled around the pasture in confusion. The rustlers' careful plans for an organized theft had been completely disrupted, but Margaret knew that desperate men with guns were often more dangerous than those operating according to a plan. "Margaret!" Running Wolf's voice carried across the distance between the house and the creek, calling her name in the Cherokee language they sometimes used when they wanted to keep their conversations private. He was warning her about something, but the continued gunfire made it difficult to understand his exact words. She caught enough to realize that more rustlers were moving around the back of the house, trying to approach from her blind side. Margaret quickly gathered extra ammunition from the kitchen drawer and made her way toward the rear of the house, staying low to avoid presenting a target through any of the windows. The back door was solidly built and heavily barred, but she knew that determined men with the right tools could breach it given enough time. She needed to prevent them from reaching the door in the first place. The back bedroom window offered a view of the area behind the house, including the small garden plot and the path that led to the outhouse. She could see movement in the shadows near the chicken coop and the distinctive silhouette of a man carrying a rifle. Margaret eased the window open, just enough to create a shooting port, trying to avoid making any noise that might alert the approaching rustler to her presence. The man emerged from behind the chicken co-op and began crossing the open ground toward the house, moving in a crouch with his weapon ready. Margaret tracked his movement through her rifle sights, waiting for him to reach a position where she could be certain of a clean shot. When he paused beside the rain barrel to scan the windows above him, she squeezed the trigger. The rustler collapsed without a sound, his rifle clattering across the hard-packed earth as he fell. Margaret worked the lever action and shifted her aim toward the chicken coop, suspecting that he hadn't been alone in his approach. Sure enough, a second figure emerged from the shadows, firing frantically in her direction as he tried to reach the cover of the house's back wall. Margaret's return shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him completely. He managed to stumble against the house wall directly below her window, making it impossible for her to get another angle on him without exposing herself to return fire. She could hear him moving along the wall, probably looking for a door or window that might give him access to the interior. From the front of the house came the sound of renewed gunfire, suggesting that the remaining rustlers were making another attempt to storm her position. Margaret realized she was being attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, a classic military tactic designed to divide her attention and prevent her from concentrating her defensive fire effectively. She would have to trust Running Wolf to handle the threats he could see while she dealt with the immediate danger at the back of the house. The wounded rustler had found the back door and was testing its strength, rattling the handle and pushing against the heavy oak planks. Margaret knew the door would hold against casual assault, but a determined man with time and leverage could eventually break through. She moved quietly through the house toward the kitchen, hoping to get a shot at him through one of the side windows. As she passed through the front room, she caught a glimpse of muzzle flashes near the barn and realized that Hendricks was still in the fight despite his wounded shoulder. The rustler leader had taken cover behind a pile of hay bales and was directing the movements of his remaining men with hand signals and shouted commands. His tactical experience was evident in the way he coordinated the assault, using suppressing fire to keep her pinned down while his men maneuvered for better positions. Running Wolf Springfield spoke again from the darkness, and Margaret saw one of the rustlers near the barn stagger and fall. The Cherokee warrior was moving between positions, using his knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead of the return fire while picking off targets of opportunity. His marksmanship was exceptional, honed by years of hunting both animals and men who threatened his people's survival. Margaret reached the side window just as the wounded rustler at the back door began trying to pry at the hinges with what sounded like a knife or small crowbar. The metallic scraping noise told her that he was making progress, and she knew she had to stop him before he gained entry to the house. She eased the window open and leaned out just far enough to see around the corner of the building. The rustler was kneeling beside the door, working frantically at the hinges while glancing nervously over his shoulder. His wounded arm hung useless at his side, but he was still dangerous enough with his good hand. Margaret took careful aim and fired, her bullet catching him in the back and ending his attempt to breach her defenses. He slumped forward against the door, his tools falling from nerveless fingers. The sudden silence from the back of the house was almost as startling as the gunfire had been. Margaret realized that she could no longer hear movement from that direction, suggesting that she'd eliminated the immediate threat to her rear defenses. But the battle was far from over, and she could still hear voices from the front of the property where Hendricks and his remaining men were regrouping for another assault. Margaret made her way back to the front windows, reloading the Winchester. As she moved, she'd fired 8 rounds since the battle began, leaving her with 10 cartridges in the rifle and another box of ammunition in the kitchen. Against 3 or 4 remaining rustlers, that should be sufficient if she made every shot count. But she knew that the next few minutes would determine whether she could hold her position or would be overwhelmed by superior numbers. As she resumed her position at the kitchen window, Margaret caught sight of a figure moving through the shadows. Near the creek, Running Wolf was repositioning again, working his way closer to the barn where Hendricks had taken cover. The Cherokee warrior understood that eliminating the Rustler leader would likely end the battle, since the remaining men would probably flee rather than continue fighting without clear leadership. The night air carried the sound of hushed voices from the direction of the barn, and Margaret strained to make out what the Rustlers were planning. She caught fragments of conversation that suggested they were considering retreat, but Hendricks' voice cut through the discussion with harsh authority. He wasn't ready to give up, despite the losses his gang had already suffered. Margaret gripped her rifle tighter and prepared for whatever came next, knowing that the battle for the Triple S Ranch was entering its most dangerous phase. The silence that followed Margaret's last shot stretched like a taut wire across the battlefield, broken only by the distant lowing of scattered cattle and the whisper of wind through the cottonwood leaves. From her position at the kitchen window, she could see the bodies of fallen rustlers lying motionless in the starlight, dark shapes that would never again threaten an honest rancher's livelihood. But the quiet felt ominous rather than peaceful, charged with the tension of predators circling just beyond the reach of Fireleg. Hendricks had gone silent behind the hay bales near the barn, and Margaret couldn't tell whether he was planning his next move or bleeding out from the shoulder wound she'd inflicted at the beginning of the fight. His remaining men had also ceased their random firing, suggesting they were either dead, wounded, or waiting for orders from their leader. The tactical pause gave her a moment to assess her situation and plan for whatever came next. Running Wolf had vanished completely from her field of vision, melting back into the shadows with the supernatural stealth that had made him legendary among both his own people and the white settlers who knew of his existence. Margaret understood that his disappearance didn't mean he'd abandoned the fight, but rather that he was positioning himself for a strike that would end the battle decisively. The Cherokee warrior had learned his tactics fighting against overwhelming odds, and he knew that sometimes victory required patience and perfect timing rather than continuous aggression. Margaret reloaded her Winchester methodically, her fingers finding each cartridge by touch in the darkness. She'd counted 6 rustlers down, including the 2 Running Wolf had killed and the 4 she'd dropped herself. That should leave only Hendricks and perhaps one other man still capable of fighting, assuming her initial count of 7 had been accurate. But wounded men could still be dangerous, and she couldn't afford to underestimate her remaining enemies. The cattle in the pasture had begun to settle somewhat, though they remained skittish and alert to the possibility of renewed violence. Several had escaped through the cut fence during the battle, but most of her herd was still contained within the damaged perimeter. If she could finish off the remaining rustlers, she might be able to repair the fence and recover the scattered animals before they wandered too far into the wilderness. A subtle movement near the barn caught her attention, and Margaret raised her rifle to peer through the sights. One of the rustlers she'd thought dead was stirring behind a water trough, his arm moving weakly as he tried to reach for a fallen weapon. The man was clearly wounded badly, but desperation could give even a dying man enough strength to fire. A lucky shot. Margaret took careful aim and squeezed the trigger, her bullet ensuring that he wouldn't threaten anyone again. The gunshot seemed to galvanize Hendricks into action. His voice boomed across the ranch yard, filled with the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Running Wolf, I know you're out there, you red devil. This is between white men, so why don't you crawl back to whatever hole you came from and let us settle this proper?" Margaret felt her blood turn cold at the casual racism in Hendricks' words, but more importantly, she realized that the rustler leader knew exactly who was helping her defend the ranch. That knowledge suggested a level of intelligence gathering that went far beyond a simple cattle theft. Hendricks had planned this raid specifically, targeting her ranch not just for its livestock but because he knew about her relationship with Running Wolf. "I know all about you and your Indian friend, Mrs. Sullivan," Hendricks continued, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. Folks in town talk about the widow woman who's got herself a Cherokee guardian angel. Some say it ain't natural, a white woman consorting with savages. Maybe it's time someone taught you the proper order of things. The implications of his words hit Margaret like a physical blow. This wasn't a random robbery, but a calculated attack designed to destroy both her ranch and her friendship with Running Wolf. Someone had been watching her property, noting the signs of Cherokee presence, and reporting back to Hendricks. The Rustler leader had chosen to strike not just for financial gain, but to send a message about the consequences of crossing racial boundaries. Margaret's anger burned, hotter than her fear, as she realized the full scope of what she was facing. Hendricks represented everything she despised about the frontier's worst elements. Men who used violence and intimidation to enforce their narrow vision of how the world should be ordered. His attack on her ranch was motivated by more than greed. It was an assault on the idea that people of different backgrounds could forge bonds of friendship and mutual respect. You picked the wrong widow to threaten, Hendricks. Margaret called back, her voice carrying clearly across the night air. And you made an even bigger mistake thinking you could come onto my land and steal what doesn't belong to you. Hendricks' laughter was harsh and mocking. Your land? This whole territory belongs to white folks now, woman. The Indians had their chance and lost it fair and square. Time you learn to accept that and stop harboring enemies of progress. Margaret was about to respond when she noticed movement in the shadows near the barn's eastern wall. A figure was creeping along the building's perimeter, staying low and moving with the fluid grace she'd learned to recognize over 23 years of friendship. Running Wolf had circled around behind the Rustlers' position and was closing in for a final strike. The Cherokee warrior carried more than just his Springfield rifle. Margaret could make out the distinctive silhouette of a tomahawk hanging from his belt, the traditional weapon of his ancestors that he'd learned to use with deadly efficiency. Running Wolf understood that close-quarters combat sometimes required silent weapons, tools that could eliminate enemies without alerting their companions to the danger. Hendricks was still shouting threats and racial slurs, his voice providing cover for Running Wolf's approach. The Rustler leader had positioned himself behind a pile of hay bales that offered excellent protection from the front, but left his flanks exposed to attack from the sides. His tactical error would prove fatal, though he didn't yet realize the magnitude of his mistake. Margaret watched in fascination as Running Wolf closed the distance to his target with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. The Cherokee warrior had learned stealth not from military manuals but from generations of ancestors who'd hunted both animals and enemies through forests where a single misstep could mean death. His approach was poetry written in shadow and silence, a demonstration of skills that connected him directly to the warrior traditions of his people. The attack, when it came, was swift and decisive. Running Wolf emerged from the shadows behind Hendricks' position like a ghost materializing from the spirit world. The tomahawk flashed once in the starlight, and Hendricks' voice cut off mid-sentence, replaced by a wet gurgling sound that spoke of mortal wounds. The Rustler leader's body slumped forward against the hay bales, his weapons falling from nerveless fingers as life fled from his body. The last remaining Rustler, who'd been crouched nearby waiting for orders, spun around at the sound of his leader's death. He managed to get his pistol halfway out of its holster before Running Wolf's tomahawk found him as well, the traditional weapon proving superior to modern firearms in the confined space behind the barn. Within seconds, both men lay still, their threat to the Triple S ranch permanently ended. Margaret lowered her rifle and leaned against the window frame, suddenly feeling the weight of exhaustion that followed intense combat. The battle was over, but the emotional cost was just beginning to register. She'd killed 4 men tonight, taking lives to defend her property and her way of life. The necessity of her actions didn't diminish the gravity of what had occurred, and she knew the memory of this night would stay with her for the rest of her days. Running Wolf emerged from behind the barn, moving with the same fluid grace he displayed during the attack. He paused to check each fallen rustler, ensuring that none posed a continued threat before approaching the house. Margaret could see him clearly now in the starlight, his face painted with traditional war colors that transformed his familiar features into something ancient and terrible. The Cherokee warrior had honored the old ways tonight, defending his blood sister with weapons and tactics that connected him to countless generations of his ancestors. The tomahawk at his belt was stained with the blood of enemies, a sacred tool that had served its purpose in protecting those he'd sworn to defend. Margaret understood that she'd witnessed something profound, a demonstration of loyalty that transcended cultural boundaries and reached back to the fundamental bonds that held communities together. As Running Wolf approached the house, Margaret unbarred the front door and stepped onto the porch to meet him. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying the scent of gunpowder, blood, and the sage that grew wild across the Montana landscape. In the distance, she could hear her cattle settling back into their normal rhythms, the immediate danger past, but the memory of violence still fresh in their animal minds. Running Wolf stopped at the foot of the porch steps, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that needed no words. The war paint on his face emphasized the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the firm line of his jaw, but Margaret could see the familiar warmth in his expression that spoke of their long friendship. He'd risked everything tonight to defend her ranch, facing armed men who wouldn't hesitate to kill an Indian found on what they considered white territory. "It's finished," Running Wolf said simply, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of a job completed successfully. "Hendricks and his men won't trouble you again." Margaret nodded, understanding that the statement encompassed more than just the immediate threat. Word of what had happened tonight would spread throughout the territory, carried by the complex network of trappers, traders, and drifters who served as the frontier's informal communication system. Other outlaws considering the Triple S Ranch as a target would think twice before approaching a property defended by both a determined widow and a Cherokee warrior willing to kill for her protection. "Thank you," Margaret said, the simple words carrying the weight of gratitude that went far beyond the night's events. "I couldn't have held them off alone." Running Wolf climbed the steps to join her on the porch, his movements fluid despite the violence he'd just committed. "Blood brothers don't fight alone," he replied, using the English translation of a Cherokee phrase that carried deeper meaning. In his native tongue, "Your enemies are my enemies, your land is my land to defend." Margaret felt tears threatening to overwhelm her composure as the full implications of what had occurred began to sink in. Running Wolf had risked not just his life but his people's safety by intervening in what others would see as a white man's conflict. If word of his involvement reached the wrong ears, it could bring unwanted attention to the small band of Cherokee who'd managed to avoid the forced relocations that had devastated their nation. "This will bring trouble for your people," Margaret sighed, voicing the concern that weighed heavily on her mind. "Hendricks knew about our friendship, which means others know as well. They might use tonight as an excuse to come looking for your band." Running Wolf considered her words carefully before responding. "My people have been hiding from those who would harm us for longer than you've been alive," he said. "We know how to disappear when necessary, how to become ghosts in our own land. But some things are worth the risk, and protecting family is always worth the risk." The word family resonated in Margaret's mind as she looked at the Cherokee warrior who'd just killed to defend her property. Their bond had grown beyond friendship into something deeper and more lasting, a connection that transcended the racial prejudices that poisoned so much of frontier society. Tonight had proven that blood brotherhood wasn't just a ceremony, but a living commitment that demanded sacrifice and courage when tested by violence. Running Wolf reached into a pouch at his side and withdrew a small object that glinted in the starlight. Margaret recognized it as one of Hendricks' silver concos, decorative pieces that had adorned the Rustler leader's belt. The Cherokee warrior held it out to her, his expression solemn. Trophy of victory, he explained. In the old days, warriors took tokens from defeated enemies to honor their courage and remember their sacrifice. Hendrix was evil, but he was also brave. His courage deserves recognition, even as his crimes demanded justice. Margaret accepted the kanko, feeling its weight in her palm. The silver was still warm from Hendrix's body, a tangible reminder of the life that had been taken to defend her ranch. She understood the Cherokee tradition behind the gesture, the way warrior cultures honored the strength of their enemies, even as they celebrated victory over them. "I'll keep it," she said, closing her fingers around the silver disc. Not to remember Hendrix, but to remember what friendship can accomplish when it's tested by violence. Running Wolf nodded approvingly, understanding that she'd grasped the deeper meaning behind the gesture. The kanko would serve as a reminder of the night when blood brotherhood had been proven in combat, when two people from different worlds had stood together against a common enemy and emerged victorious. The eastern horizon was beginning to show. The faintest trace of dawn, the deep black of night, gradually giving way to the gray that preceded sunrise. Margaret realized that she'd been fighting for her life and property for what felt like hours, but had probably been less than 30 minutes of actual combat. Time seemed to compress during violent encounters, making seconds feel like minutes, and minutes like hours. "We need to deal with the bodies," Margaret said, her practical nature asserting itself despite the emotional weight of the night's events. "And I'll need to repair that fence before my remaining cattle wander off." Running Wolf surveyed the ranch yard, counting the fallen rustlers scattered across the property. 7 men, he said. "More than either of us expected when this began." Hendrix brought a full war party, not just a few hungry drifters. Margaret followed his gaze, seeing her property transformed into a battlefield littered with the bodies of men who'd tried to steal her future. The sight was sobering, a stark reminder of how quickly violence could erupt on the frontier and how final its consequences could be. Each fallen rustler represented someone's son, perhaps someone's father or brother, though their choices had made them enemies of honest society. "I'll help you bury them," Running Wolf offered. "It's important to treat the dead with respect, even enemies. Their spirits need to find peace, or they'll wander the earth causing trouble for the living." Margaret appreciated both the practical offer and the spiritual wisdom behind it. Cherokee beliefs about death and the afterlife emphasized the importance of proper treatment for the deceased, regardless of the circumstances that had led to their passing. Burying the rustlers with dignity would serve both practical and spiritual purposes, preventing their bodies from attracting scavengers while helping their souls find rest. As dawn approached, Margaret and Running Wolf began the grim task of cleaning up after the battle, working together to restore order to the S ranch and ensure that the violence of the night wouldn't continue to haunt the property in the days to come. The first pale fingers of dawn crept across the Montana sky like spilled milk spreading across dark cloth, revealing the full scope of devastation that littered the S ranch. Margaret stood on her porch beside Running Wolf, both of them surveying the battlefield that her property had become during the night's violence. 7 bodies lay scattered across the ranch yard, some sprawled beside the cut fence, others crumpled near the barn where Hendrix had made his final stand. The morning light transformed what had been shadowy shapes into stark reminders of mortality, each fallen rustler a testament to the price of choosing the outlaw trail. Running Wolf had washed the war paint from his face using water from Margaret's well, returning his features to the familiar contours she'd known for more than 2 decades. But something fundamental had changed in his expression during the night's fighting. The peaceful farmer and hunter she'd befriended beside Willow Creek had temporarily given way to the ancient warrior that lived within every Cherokee man, and traces of that transformation still lingered in the set of his shoulders and the alertness of his gaze. "We'll need to work quickly," Running Wolf said, his voice carrying the practical tone of someone accustomed to dealing with violence and its consequences. Word travels fast in this territory, and by noon there'll be folks riding out from town to see what all the shooting was about. Better they find everything cleaned up and orderly when they arrive. Margaret nodded, understanding the wisdom behind his urgency. The territorial authorities would need to be satisfied that the violence had been justified, self-defense rather than murder, and the appearance of the scene would influence their conclusions as much as any testimony she might provide. A ranch yard littered with bodies would raise uncomfortable questions, while a tidy property with signs of forced entry and theft would support her version of events. They began with the most unpleasant task, dragging the bodies of the fallen rustlers to a level spot near the creek where the digging would be easier. Running Wolf handled the work with the detached efficiency of someone who'd dealt with battlefield cleanup before, while Margaret forced herself to maintain the practical mindset that had carried her through 8 years of frontier widowhood. Each body told a story of choices made and consequences faced, but dwelling on the human cost of the night's violence would serve no useful purpose. Jake Hendricks had been a large man in life, and his corpse proved correspondingly difficult to move. The tomahawk wound that had killed him was precise and clean, delivered by someone who understood anatomy well enough to ensure instant death. Running Wolf showed no emotion as he handled the body of the man who'd threatened Margaret's life and property, treating the Rustler leader's remains with the same respectful efficiency he accorded to all the dead. Hendricks was military, Running Wolf observed as they positioned the body beside the growing line of corpses. Cavalry, probably, based on the way he moved and the equipment he carried. Lot of former soldiers turned to rustling after the war ended. Some men find it hard to go back to peaceful living once they've tasted battle. Margaret studied Hendricks' face in the growing daylight, noting the weathered features and the scar that marked him as a veteran of violence. The Rustler leader had probably been younger than he appeared, aged prematurely by exposure to the elements and the stress of living outside the law. His clothing was better quality than his followers, suggesting he'd been successful in his criminal enterprises before encountering the determined resistance at the Triple S Ranch. "How many ranches do you think he hit before coming here?" Margaret asked, more to distract herself from the grim task than out of genuine curiosity. "Dozen. Maybe more," Running Wolf replied, checking the pockets of another corpse for identification or personal effects. Rustling gangs like this don't form overnight. Takes time to build the kind of organization that could plan an operation like they tried here. Hendricks probably spent months scouting targets and recruiting men before he felt ready to tackle a defended ranch. The implication of his words struck Margaret with renewed force. Her ranch hadn't been a random target, but a carefully selected objective in what amounted to a criminal campaign. Hendricks had studied her routines, noted her isolation, and planned his attack with the thoroughness of a military operation. The only factor he hadn't accounted for was the presence of a Cherokee warrior willing to kill in defense of blood. Brotherhood. As they worked, Running Wolf shared details about tracking and counter-tracking that revealed how thoroughly he'd been monitoring the approaching threat. The Rustlers had been camping in a hidden valley 15 miles to the north for almost a week, sending scouts to observe the ranch and plan their assault. Running Wolf had discovered their presence 3 days earlier, but had chosen to wait and see what they intended rather than warning Margaret prematurely. "I wanted to be certain of their intentions," he explained. "Lot of drifters pass through this country looking for work or just moving on to somewhere else. Didn't want to alarm you unnecessarily if they turned out to be harmless." Margaret appreciated his discretion, understanding that false alarms could be as disruptive as real threats. But she also realized how close she'd come to facing the Rustlers without any warning at all. If Running Wolf hadn't been watching over her property, the first indication of danger might have been gunshots in the night, and her cattle disappearing into the darkness. The process of searching the bodies revealed the professional nature of Hendricks' operation. Each Rustler carried quality weapons and equipment, along with significant amounts of cash that suggested recent successful raids. Margaret found herself looking at more money than she'd seen in years, currency that represented the stolen dreams of other ranchers who'd been less fortunate than herself. "Blood money," Running Wolf said when she commented on the cash, "belongs to the families these men robbed. Problem is, there's no way to know which money came from which ranch. Best thing would be to turn it over to the territorial marshal and let him try to sort it out." Margaret agreed, though she couldn't help thinking about how much that money could help her improve the ranch's defenses or expand her herd. The temptation was real, but easily dismissed. Keeping stolen goods would make her no better than they. Men who'd tried to rob her, and she'd built her life on principles that couldn't be compromised for temporary financial gain. They found correspondence in Hendricks' saddlebags that revealed the scope of his criminal network. Letters from contacts in distant territories, maps marking potential targets, and detailed notes about the defenses and vulnerabilities of various ranches painted a picture of organized crime that extended far beyond. Montana, the Rustler leader, had been part of a larger conspiracy that threatened honest settlers throughout the frontier region. "This needs to go to the authorities," Margaret said, studying a letter that mentioned planned raids in Wyoming and Colorado. "Other ranchers deserve warning about what they might be facing." Running Wolf examined the documents with the eye of someone who understood both military intelligence and the criminal mind. Hendricks was planning to expand his operation, he said. "This raid on your ranch was supposed to provide the capital for recruiting more men and hitting bigger targets. Your resistance probably saved a lot of other folks from losing their life's work." The weight of that responsibility sat heavily on Margaret's shoulders as she contemplated how many families might have been destroyed if Hendricks had succeeded in stealing her cattle and using the proceeds to finance a larger criminal enterprise. The violence of the night had served a purpose beyond defending her own property. It had disrupted a network of organized crime that threatened the stability of frontier society. As the sun climbed higher, they turned their attention to repairing the fence that the rustlers had cut to access her cattle. The damage was more extensive than it had appeared in the darkness, requiring not just replacement wire, but new posts where the rustlers had damaged the wooden supports. Margaret fetched tools from the barn while Running Wolf gathered materials for the repairs. Working together in the growing warmth of the morning sun, they restored the fence to its original condition while discussing the long-term implications of the night's events. Word of the failed raid would spread throughout the criminal community, marking the Triple S Ranch as a dangerous target that had cost a successful gang their lives. That reputation would provide some protection against future threats, but it might also attract more determined criminals looking to prove themselves against a legendary defender. "Some men see a challenge where others see a warning," Running Wolf observed as he set a new fence post. Hendricks' reputation might bring copycats looking to succeed where he failed. Margaret had considered the same possibility, understanding that surviving one attack didn't guarantee safety from future threats, but she also knew that retreat wasn't an option. The Triple S Ranch represented everything she and Thomas had worked to build, and abandoning it would dishonor his memory, while destroying her own future. If other outlaws wanted to test themselves against her defenses, they would find her ready to meet their challenge. The work of fence repair provided a therapeutic rhythm that helped process the emotional aftermath of the night's violence. Margaret found comfort in the familiar tasks of measuring, cutting, and securing wire, practical activities that connected her to the normal routines of ranch life. Running Wolf worked with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to manual labor, his hands skilled with tools despite his warrior's training. As they worked, neighbors began arriving to investigate the disturbance. The first was old Pete Carlson from the adjacent ranch, riding up the valley with his rifle across his saddle and his eyes scanning for signs of trouble. Pete had heard the gunfire during the night, but had waited for daylight before investigating. A practical decision that reflected the realities of frontier life. "Heard quite a commotion from your direction last night, Margaret," Pete called as he approached the fence line. "Everything all right over here?" Margaret exchanged a quick glance with Running Wolf, who had positioned himself to be less visible. From the approach route, they discussed how to handle inquiries from neighbors and authorities, agreeing that the truth would serve better than any elaborate deception. Most frontier residents understood the necessity of defending property against rustlers and would support her actions if presented properly. "Had some uninvited visitors trying to make off with my cattle," Margaret replied, gesturing toward the repaired fence. "Managed to discourage them from completing their business." Pete's weathered face creased into a knowing smile as he took in the signs of recent violence, the disturbed earth, and the fresh graves beside the creek. "Discouraged them permanent-like, from the look of things," he said with approval. "About time someone taught these rustling gangs that honest folks won't be pushed around." The neighbors' reaction set the tone for subsequent arrivals. Within 2 hours, representatives from 3 other ranches had ridden over to assess the situation and offer assistance with cleanup or additional security. The frontier community's response to the attempted theft was uniformly supportive, with several neighbors volunteering to help patrol the area in case other members of Hendricks' gang attempted revenge. Margaret appreciated the offers of support, but politely declined most assistance, understanding that accepting too much help might lead to uncomfortable questions about how a lone widow had managed to defeat 7 armed rustlers. The fiction that she'd held them off single-handedly was more believable than the truth about Cherokee intervention, and it would better protect Running Wolf's people from unwanted scrutiny. By mid-morning, Territorial Marshal Sam Wheeler arrived to conduct an official investigation of the incident. Wheeler was a practical man who understood frontier justice and the realities of defending isolated property against criminal gangs. His examination of the scene was thorough but sympathetic, focusing more on documenting the rustlers' criminal intent than questioning the legality of Margaret's response. "Jake Hendricks," Wheeler said when he identified the gang leader's body. "Been hunting that snake for 2 years. You did the territory a service by putting him down, Mrs. Sullivan. That gang was responsible for hitting at least 12 ranches between here and the Wyoming border." The marshal's words confirmed what Margaret had suspected about the scope of Hendricks' criminal activities. Wheeler showed her wanted posters for several members of the gang, along with details about their previous raids that painted a picture of escalating violence and increasing boldness. The rustlers had been growing more confident with each successful theft, and the Triple S Ranch might have represented their transition from simple cattle theft to more serious crimes. "Any idea how you managed to take down so many armed men?" Wheeler asked, his question carrying professional curiosity rather than suspicion. Margaret had prepared for this inquiry, crafting a response that contained enough truth to be believable, while omitting details that might endanger Running Wolf. "Had good defensive positions in the house," she said. "They weren't expecting serious resistance from a woman, so they got careless. Once I dropped a couple of them, the others started making mistakes." Wheeler nodded approvingly, accepting the explanation that fit his preconceptions about criminal overconfidence and frontier justice. The marshal understood that desperate people fighting for their homes and livelihoods could achieve remarkable things when properly motivated, and he had no desire to complicate a clear case of justified self-defense with unnecessary questions. Official investigation concluded with Wheeler's recommendation that Margaret be commended for her courage in defending her property against organized criminals. The territorial government would handle notification of next of kin for the dead rustlers, along with processing any claims against their possessions. Margaret would keep the stolen money found on their bodies as partial compensation for her damages and trouble. As the marshal prepared to leave, he offered a piece of advice that reflected his years of experience dealing with frontier crime. "You might want to consider getting some help around here," he suggested. "Word of what happened will spread, and some folks might see a woman alone as an invitation to try their luck." Margaret thanked him for the concern while privately reflecting that she already had the best protection available in the territory. Running Wolf's guardianship had proven itself during the night's violence, and she had no doubt that he would continue watching over the Triple S Ranch with the dedication that had sustained their friendship for more than 2 decades. As the afternoon wore on and the last of the official visitors departed, Margaret and Running Wolf completed the cleanup and restoration of her property. The graves beside the creek were marked with simple wooden crosses that provided dignity for the dead while serving as a warning to future criminals. The fence stood strong and intact, ready to contain her cattle and mark the boundaries of property that had been defended with blood and determination. Standing together on the porch as evening approached, Margaret and Running Wolf surveyed the ranch that had become a battlefield and had been restored to peace through their combined efforts. The violence of the night had tested their blood brotherhood in the most fundamental way possible, proving that the bonds forged in ceremony could endure the ultimate trial of life and death combat. "There'll be others," Running Wolf said quietly, acknowledging the reality that one victory didn't guarantee permanent safety. "Let them come," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had faced the worst and emerged victorious. "This ranch has been paid for in blood, and I'm not about to let anyone take it away." The Cherokee warrior nodded approvingly, understanding that the night's events had transformed Margaret from a woman defending her property into a legend that would grow with each telling. The story of the widow who defeated Jake Hendricks and his gang would spread throughout the territory, carrying with it a message that the Triple S Ranch was under the protection of forces that transcended the ordinary boundaries of frontier society. As darkness fell once again over the Montana landscape, Margaret and Running Wolf prepared to resume their eternal vigilance, knowing that their blood brotherhood had been forged anew in the crucible of violence and would endure whatever challenges the future might bring to the ranch they had defended. Together, 3 months had passed since the night Jake Hendricks and his gang had tried to steal Margaret Sullivan's future, and the story of their defeat had grown with each telling throughout the Montana territory. What had begun as a simple case of justified self-defense had transformed into frontier legend, with details that became more elaborate and dramatic as the tale traveled from ranch to saloon to trading post across the vast wilderness. Some versions credited Margaret with supernatural marksmanship, claiming she'd dropped 7 armed men with 7 perfect shots fired from her kitchen window. Others whispered about ghostly assistance from spirits of the land, who'd risen to defend a righteous widow against criminal predators. The truth about Running Wolf's involvement remained carefully guarded, known only to Margaret and the Cherokee warrior himself, but the mystery surrounding the unlikely victory only enhanced the growing legend. Margaret stood in her kitchen on a crisp December morning, preparing coffee while watching fresh snow fall across the ranch yard where so much blood had been spilled. The graves beside Willow Creek were now marked by simple wooden crosses dusted with white, their stark presence serving as a permanent reminder of the night that had changed everything. The fence had been rebuilt stronger than before, and her cattle had multiplied through careful breeding and the addition of stock purchased with reward money from the territorial government. The financial compensation for eliminating Hendricks' gang had been substantial, reflecting both the official bounty on the Rustler leader and gratitude from ranchers throughout the region who'd been terrorized by his operations. Margaret had used the money wisely, investing in improvements to her ranch's defenses and expanding her herd to levels that ensured genuine prosperity for the first time since Thomas's death. The Triple S Ranch was no longer a struggling operation, but a successful enterprise that commanded respect throughout Yellowstone County. But prosperity had brought its own complications. Margaret's transformation from vulnerable widow to frontier legend had attracted attention from sources she'd never anticipated. 3 separate men had arrived over the past month, each seeking to court a woman whose reputation for courage and independence had spread far beyond Montana's borders. The suitors represented different aspects of frontier society, from a successful merchant in Billings to a former cavalry officer turned rancher to a circuit-riding preacher who claimed divine inspiration had led him to her door. Margaret had politely but firmly declined all romantic advances, understanding that these men were attracted more to her legend than to her person. They saw her as a prize to be won, a frontier celebrity whose association would enhance their own status in territorial society. None had shown genuine interest in understanding the woman behind the reputation, and all had displayed uncomfortable attitudes toward her friendship with Running Wolf. When they'd discovered hints of the Cherokee warrior's existence, the most persistent suitor had been Captain Reynolds, the former cavalry officer whose ranch bordered her property to the south. Reynolds was a handsome man in his 40s, possessed of the kind of military bearing and confident manner that many women found attractive. His courtship had been conducted with strategic precision, beginning with offers of assistance and protection, before escalating to direct proposals of marriage that emphasized the practical advantages of combining their properties. A woman shouldn't be living alone in this wilderness, Reynolds had argued during his most recent visit. You've proven your courage admirably, but even the strongest individual needs allies in this harsh country. Together, we could build something truly substantial, an operation that would dominate this entire valley. Margaret had listened to his proposal with the courtesy due a neighbor, but his words revealed motivations that had little to do with genuine affection. Reynolds saw her ranch as a valuable addition to his own holdings, and her reputation as a useful asset in his social and political ambitions. The captain's vision of their future together involved her surrendering the independence she'd fought so hard to maintain in exchange for the protection and social status that marriage to a prominent man would provide. I appreciate your offer, Captain, Margaret had replied with careful diplomacy, but I've built a good life here on my own terms. I'm not looking to change those arrangements. Reynolds had accepted her refusal with military grace, but Margaret sensed that he viewed her rejection as a temporary tactical setback rather than a final answer. Men like the captain were accustomed to achieving their objectives through persistence and strategic maneuvering, and he would likely return with modified approaches until she found a way to discourage his attention permanently. The unwanted courtship had prompted deeper conversations with Running Wolf about the future of their relationship and the potential complications that her growing fame might create. The Cherokee warrior had observed the parade of suitors with quiet amusement, understanding better than Margaret herself how her legendary status would continue to attract men seeking to associate themselves with frontier celebrity. Fame is like a bright fire, Running Wolf had observed during one of their evening conversations by Willow Creek. It provides warmth and light, but it also draws insects and predators who want to feed on its energy. Some of those creatures are harmless, but others can be dangerous if they're not handled properly. Margaret had come to appreciate the wisdom of his metaphor, recognizing that her reputation carried both benefits and risks that required careful management. The legend of her victory over Hendrick's gang provided excellent protection against common criminals, who now gave the Triple S Ranch a wide berth rather than risk confronting someone capable of defeating 7 armed rustlers. But that same reputation attracted ambitious men who saw her as a path to advancement in territorial society, along with curiosity seekers and adventure hunters who wanted to meet the famous widow, warrior of Montana. The most disturbing development had been the arrival of newspaper correspondents from eastern cities, drawn by stories of frontier violence and feminine heroism that their readers found irresistibly romantic. 2 different reporters had made the journey to her ranch, seeking interviews about her battle with the Rustlers and her life as an independent woman in the wilderness. Margaret had declined all requests for formal interviews, understanding that Eastern newspapers would sensationalize her story in ways that could bring unwanted attention from sources far more dangerous than local suitors. The reporter's interest reflected a growing fascination with frontier life among Eastern audiences who romanticized the violence and freedom of the American West, while remaining safely distant from its realities. Margaret's story represented everything these readers craved: dramatic confrontation between good and evil, a strong female protagonist defying conventional limitations, and exotic frontier settings that seemed impossibly remote from civilized society. But the truth behind her victory was far more complex and politically sensitive than any newspaper could safely publish. The involvement of a Cherokee warrior in defending a white woman's property touched on racial tensions that could inflame prejudices throughout the territory if revealed carelessly. Margaret understood that protecting Running Wolf's anonymity was essential not just for his safety, but for the welfare of his entire people, who survived by avoiding the attention of those who would use any excuse to complete the cultural destruction that federal policies had begun. The burden of maintaining necessary secrets had grown heavier as her legend expanded. Each retelling of her story required careful editing to remove any details that might expose Running Wolf's role in the battle, while ensuring that the remaining narrative remained believable and consistent. Margaret had become skilled at deflecting questions about how she'd managed to defeat so many armed men, developing stock responses that satisfied curiosity without revealing dangerous truths. "Fear makes men careless," she would explain when pressed for tactical details. They expected easy victory over a helpless woman, and their overconfidence created opportunities for someone who was properly motivated and well-positioned. Explanation contained enough truth to be convincing, while omitting the crucial fact that she'd had expert assistance from someone whose warrior training far exceeded anything the Rustlers had encountered. Most listeners accepted her account readily, preferring to believe in individual heroism rather than questioning the practical impossibilities of her supposed single-handed victory. Running Wolf had adapted to the changed circumstances with the flexibility that had allowed his people to survive decades of persecution and displacement. The Cherokee warrior had become even more careful about visiting the ranch openly, timing his appearances to avoid the stream of visitors and curiosity seekers who now made regular pilgrimages to see where the famous battle had occurred. His protection of the property had become more sophisticated rather than less vigilant, with an extended network of observation posts and warning systems that would detect threats long before they could reach the ranch itself. "Your victory has made you safer from some enemies and more vulnerable to others," Running Wolf had explained during a late-night conversation in Margaret's kitchen. "Common criminals fear your reputation, but ambitious men see opportunity in your fame. We need to adjust our defenses accordingly." The Cherokee warrior had spent considerable time studying the new types of threats that Margaret's reputation might attract, from political opportunists seeking to exploit her celebrity to federal officials who might investigate rumors about her connections to indigenous peoples. His analysis of potential dangers had led to the development of more sophisticated security measures that could handle threats requiring subtlety rather than direct violence. Margaret had learned to read the signals that indicated Running Wolf's assessment of various visitors and situations. A particular arrangement of stones near her well meant that he'd identified potential threats among recent arrivals, while other patterns warned of federal officials or journalists whose presence might require special precautions. The communication system they'd developed over the years had evolved to handle the increased complexity of managing her public reputation while protecting their private friendship. The most significant challenge had come from an unexpected source. Running Wolf's own people had begun questioning the wisdom of his continued involvement with a woman whose fame was drawing unwanted attention to Cherokee presence in the territory. The small band of refugees who'd avoided federal relocation efforts had survived by maintaining absolute invisibility, becoming ghosts in their own ancestral lands to avoid the fate that had befallen most of their nation. Some members of the band argued that Running Wolf's blood brotherhood with Margaret had outlived its usefulness and now posed unnecessary risks to their collective survival. The Cherokee Leadership Council had met in secret to discuss whether his continued protection of the Triple-S Ranch violated their fundamental principle of avoiding any contact with white society that might expose their existence to federal authorities. Running Wolf had defended his position with passionate eloquence, arguing that abandoning Margaret would violate the most sacred obligations of Cherokee honor while providing no meaningful improvement in their security situation. His blood sister had proven her worthiness through courage in battle and discretion in protecting Cherokee secrets, making her more valuable as an ally than dangerous as a potential source of exposure. Margaret Sullivan has kept our secrets better than some of our own people, Running Wolf had told the council. She's earned the right to our protection through her own blood and sacrifice. Abandoning her now would make us no better than the government officials who break treaties whenever keeping them becomes inconvenient. The debate within the Cherokee band had continued for weeks, reflecting fundamental disagreements about survival strategies in an increasingly hostile environment. Older members of the group favored absolute isolation as the only safe policy, while younger warriors argued that selective alliances with trustworthy whites might provide advantages that outweighed the risks of exposure. The resolution had come through Margaret's own actions rather than Cherokee deliberation. When she'd learned about the internal controversy surrounding Running Wolf's protection of her ranch, she'd insisted on addressing the Cherokee Council directly to present her perspective on their mutual relationship and its implications for their security. The meeting had taken place in a hidden valley deep in the Burtooth Mountains, where the Cherokee refugees had established a seasonal camp that could be abandoned quickly if discovery threatened. Margaret had ridden there alone, following directions that Running Wolf had provided with obvious reluctance, understanding that her appearance at the secret gathering represented an unprecedented breach of Cherokee security protocols. The council members had received her with formal courtesy, tinged by obvious suspicion, uncertain whether her presence represented opportunity or catastrophe for their precarious existence. Margaret had addressed them in the mixture of English and Cherokee phrases that Running Wolf had taught her over the years, showing respect for their culture while acknowledging the gravity of the situation that had brought them together. "I know that protecting me has caused problems within your community," Margaret had begun, speaking slowly to ensure her words were clearly understood. "I also know that my friendship with Running Wolf has put all of you at risk by creating connections between your people and the outside world. I'm here to offer you a choice that might solve both problems." Margaret had then presented a proposal that surprised everyone present, including Running Wolf himself. She offered to relocate her ranch operation to a different territory, removing herself and her growing fame from the area where the Cherokee band sought to remain hidden. The relocation would eliminate any risk that her celebrity might attract unwanted attention to Cherokee presence in the region, while allowing Running Wolf to maintain his blood brother obligations without endangering his people. The offer had generated intense discussion among the council members, who recognized both the sacrifice it represented and the wisdom of its strategic implications. Margaret's willingness to abandon the ranch she defended with blood demonstrated the sincerity of her commitment to Cherokee welfare, while her proposed relocation would indeed eliminate most of the security concerns that her presence created. But Running Wolf had rejected the proposal with immediate and absolute finality, understanding that accepting Margaret's sacrifice would fundamentally alter the nature of their relationship in ways that violated everything he valued about their friendship. Blood brotherhood implied mutual protection and support, not the abandonment of one partner when circumstances became challenging. "My blood sister stays where she belongs," Running Wolf had declared to the council. "This is her land, earned through the same kind of struggle our ancestors faced when they fought to defend Cherokee territory. If we can't protect someone who's proven her worthiness through courage and loyalty, then we've lost more than our land, we've lost our honor." The Cherokee warriors' passionate defense of their friendship had resonated with council members who understood the cultural importance of honoring commitments made in blood and ceremony. After lengthy deliberation, the council had voted to support Running Wolf's continued protection of Margaret's ranch, while implementing additional security measures to minimize any risks that their association might create. The resolution had strengthened rather than strained the bonds between Margaret and Running Wolf, proving that their friendship could survive external pressures and internal doubts. Both had learned valuable lessons about the prices of fame and the responsibilities that came with maintaining relationships across cultural boundaries in an increasingly complex world. As winter deepened across the Montana landscape, Margaret found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from vulnerable widow to frontier legend to trusted ally of a hidden Cherokee community. The transformation had required courage she'd never known she possessed, along with wisdom about managing public reputation while protecting private truths. The ranch that had once represented simple survival now symbolized something far more significant, proof that friendship could transcend racial prejudice, that courage could overcome overwhelming odds, and that some bonds were strong enough to withstand any test that fate might devise. The Triple S Ranch had become more than Margaret's home. It was a sanctuary where two worlds could meet safely, protected by mutual respect and defended by blood brotherhood that had been proven in the crucible of mortal combat. Standing at her kitchen window on a snowy December evening, Margaret watched Running Wolf emerge from the tree line near Willow Creek, moving with the fluid grace that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. He carried fresh game for her larder and news from the outside world, maintaining his role as protector and friend, despite all the complications that her fame had created. As he approached the house, Margaret reflected on the words he'd spoken after their victory over Hendrick's gang. Blood brothers don't fight alone. The promise had been tested by violence, political pressure, and social complications, but it had emerged stronger from every challenge. The legend of the widow who defeated 7 rustlers would continue to grow and evolve, drawing curious visitors and ambitious suitors to the Triple S Ranch. But the truth behind that legend, the story of two people from different worlds who'd forged an unbreakable bond of friendship and mutual protection, would remain safely hidden, known only to those who'd lived it and proven themselves worthy of its trust. In the warmth of her kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of prosperity earned through courage and defended through loyalty, Margaret Sullivan understood that she'd found something rarer and more valuable than gold or cattle or frontier fame. She discovered that a true family wasn't limited by blood or culture, but created through choice, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand together against whatever enemies the world might send. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the graves beside Willow Creek and the rebuilt fence that marked the boundaries of land defended with blood and honor. Inside the house, Margaret prepared coffee for 2, knowing that some traditions transcended all changes, and that the most important victories were measured not in defeated enemies, but in friendships that endured beyond all reasonable expectations. The legend would live on. But the truth was even better. Winter's grip tightened on the Montana territory as January arrived with blizzards that painted the landscape in pristine white and drove temperatures so low that the creek froze solid for the first time in Margaret's memory. The isolation that came with the season provided welcome relief from the stream of visitors who'd made pilgrimages to the Triple S Ranch throughout the autumn months. Now, with snowdrifts reaching the windows and wind howling across the plains like the voices of ancient spirits, Margaret found herself enjoying the enforced solitude that winter brought. But the cold months also brought their own unique challenges and opportunities. The Cherokee band had established winter quarters in a series of natural caves 20 miles northeast of the ranch, hidden so thoroughly in the mountain wilderness that even experienced trappers would be unlikely to discover them by accident. Running Wolf had invited Margaret to visit the winter camp, an unprecedented honor that reflected both the trust she'd earned and the practical advantages of strengthening ties between their communities. The journey to the Cherokee winter settlement required careful planning and considerable skill in cold weather travel. Margaret had learned mountain survival techniques from Thomas during their early years together, when unexpected storms had trapped them far from home on several occasions. But traveling alone through 20 miles of wilderness in sub-zero temperatures represented a level of risk that most frontier residents would consider suicidal. Running Wolf had spent 2 weeks preparing for the expedition, catching supplies along the route and identifying shelter locations where they could wait out dangerous weather if necessary. The Cherokee warrior understood mountain conditions with an intimacy that came from generations of ancestors who'd survived harsh winters without the benefit of modern equipment or established trails. Weather in the high country can change faster than a horse can run, Running Wolf had explained while reviewing their planned route. Storm that seems distant in the morning can trap you in killing cold before sunset. We'll move carefully and turn back at the first sign of serious trouble. Margaret had appreciated both his caution and his willingness to include her in what amounted to a military reconnaissance mission. The Cherokee band's survival depended on maintaining absolute security around their winter quarters, and her presence would represent a calculated risk that they were taking only because of her proven trustworthiness and the strategic value of strengthening their alliance. The expedition had begun before dawn on a clear February morning when the temperature stood at 15 degrees below zero, and the snow crunched underfoot with the crystalline sound that indicated truly bitter cold. Margaret had bundled herself in layers of wool and fur, carrying minimal equipment but sufficient supplies to survive several days if weather forced an extended stay at the Cherokee camp. Running Wolf moved through the winter landscape with an efficiency that seemed almost supernatural, reading snow conditions and wind patterns with the instinctive skill that allowed him to select the safest routes through potentially treacherous terrain. His knowledge of the mountains included understanding where avalanches were likely to occur, which streams remained unfrozen and could provide emergency water, and how to recognize the subtle signs that indicated severe weather approaching from beyond the visible horizon. The journey had taken 8 hours of steady travel through wilderness so remote that Margaret saw no evidence of human presence other than their own tracks in the snow. They'd passed through forests of pine and aspen, where the only sounds were the whisper of wind through branches and the distant calls of winter birds, creating an atmosphere of profound solitude that made the civilized world seem impossibly distant. Cherokee Winter Camp, when they finally reached it, proved to be a masterpiece of concealment and practical organization. The natural caves provided shelter from wind and cold while remaining invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Careful arrangements of brush and fallen logs disguised the entrances so thoroughly that Margaret had walked within 10 feet of the main opening without realizing it existed. Inside the caves, she'd discovered a complex community that had adapted traditional Cherokee lifestyle to the harsh realities of mountain winter survival. The refugees had created comfortable living spaces using natural rock formations and carefully constructed partitions, while maintaining cooking and working areas that produced no external smoke or light that might betray their presence to unwanted observers. The Cherokee band consisted of 37 people ranging in age from an infant born the previous autumn to an elderly medicine woman, whose knowledge of traditional healing practices had made her invaluable to the community's survival efforts. Margaret had been struck by the quiet dignity with which these people maintained their cultural identity despite the constant threat of discovery and forced relocation that hung over their existence. The medicine woman, known as Grandmother Willow, had received Margaret with formal courtesy that gradually warmed into genuine friendship as they'd shared stories and compared their respective knowledge of healing herbs and frontier survival techniques. The elderly Cherokee woman possessed a vast store of traditional knowledge that encompassed everything from treating injuries and illnesses to predicting weather patterns and understanding animal behavior. "Your Cherokee brother speaks well of your courage and wisdom," Grandmother Willow had said during their first conversation. Few white women would risk a winter journey to visit people they barely know. Fewer still would offer to abandon their homes to protect strangers from danger. Margaret had been touched by the respect in the medicine woman's voice, understanding that acceptance from Cherokee elders represented a profound honor that was never granted lightly. The conversation had led to exchanges of knowledge that benefited both women, with Margaret sharing techniques for preserving food and treating livestock diseases while learning Cherokee methods for crafting medicines from mountain plants and reading weather signs that weren't obvious to untrained observers. The winter visit had extended to a full week when an unexpected blizzard had made travel impossible for several days. During that time, Margaret had experienced Cherokee community life firsthand, participating in daily routines and observing the remarkable ways these people had preserved their cultural traditions. Despite decades of persecution and displacement, Cherokee refugees had maintained their language, storytelling traditions, and spiritual practices while adapting to circumstances that required constant vigilance and mobility. Children learned traditional crafts alongside survival skills that might mean the difference between life and death if the community was forced to relocate suddenly. Adults balanced the preservation of ancient knowledge with the practical necessities of remaining hidden from government officials and hostile settlers. Margaret had been particularly impressed by the community's decision-making processes, which involved extensive consultation and consensus building rather than authoritarian leadership. Every significant choice was discussed by the full council of adults, with special weight given to the advice of elders whose experience and wisdom commanded universal respect. The Cherokee approach to community leadership stood in sharp contrast to the individualistic culture that dominated frontier society, where strong personalities and decisive action were valued over consultation and consensus. Margaret had found herself thinking about the advantages of the Cherokee system, particularly the way it ensured that all community members felt heard and valued regardless of their economic status or social position. During evening gatherings around carefully contained fires that produced minimal smoke, Margaret had listened to traditional Cherokee stories that carried both entertainment value and important cultural lessons. The tales often featured animals as central characters, with stories that taught practical survival skills alongside moral principles about the proper relationships between humans and the natural world. One particularly memorable story had described a widow who'd been helped by forest spirits during a harsh winter. Receiving assistance that allowed her to survive until spring brought renewed hope and prosperity. The parallels to Margaret's own situation hadn't been lost on anyone present, and she'd understood that the story was intended partly as a commentary on her relationship with Running Wolf and the Cherokee community. Stories changed to reflect new circumstances, Grandmother Willow had explained afterward. Traditional tales grow to include modern experiences while preserving ancient wisdom. Your friendship with Running Wolf becomes part of Cherokee story tradition, teaching future generations about the possibilities for cooperation between different peoples. The idea that her life had become part of Cherokee cultural tradition had been both humbling and inspiring, representing a form of immortality that transcended individual existence while contributing to the collective memory of a people struggling to preserve their identity in an increasingly hostile world. The week in the Cherokee winter camp had also provided Margaret with new perspectives on her own situation and the challenges she faced as a woman alone on the frontier. The Cherokee community's emphasis on mutual support and collective responsibility highlighted the isolation that characterized much of white frontier society, where individual achievement was valued over community cooperation. Margaret had begun to understand why Running Wolf maintained such strong loyalty to his people, despite the risks that his blood brotherhood with her created for their security. The Cherokee band represented more than just cultural preservation. It embodied a different way of understanding human relationships and social responsibility that offered alternatives to the competitive individualism that dominated territorial society. The return journey to the Triple S Ranch had been complicated by fresh snowfall that obscured familiar landmarks and created new hazards in previously safe areas. Running Wolf had demonstrated remarkable skill in navigation and weather prediction, guiding them safely through conditions that could easily have proven fatal to less experienced travelers. Back at her ranch, Margaret had found herself viewing her property with new eyes, understanding how her individual success connected to broader patterns of cooperation and mutual support that extended far beyond the boundaries of white settlement. The Cherokee winter camp had shown her alternative models for community organization that emphasized collective welfare over individual achievement. The experience had also strengthened her resolve to protect the Cherokee band's security while maintaining the friendship that had proven so valuable to both sides. Margaret understood that her growing fame created ongoing risks for Running Wolf's people, but she'd also learned that abandoning the relationship would eliminate valuable opportunities for mutual assistance and cultural exchange. Spring's arrival brought renewed challenges as melting snow revealed winter damage to ranch buildings and infrastructure while creating muddy conditions that made travel difficult throughout the territory. Margaret had spent weeks repairing fence lines damaged by heavy snow loads and restoring water systems disrupted by freezing temperatures, work that would have been impossible without the practical knowledge she'd gained during her winter stay. With the Cherokee community, the seasonal transition also brought the return of visitors and curiosity, seekers who'd been deterred by winter weather, but now resumed their pilgrimages to the site of the famous battle with Hendrick's gang. Margaret had developed more sophisticated strategies for managing unwanted attention, using Running Wolf's intelligence network to identify potentially problematic visitors before they reached her property. Among the spring arrivals was a federal Indian agent named Morrison who'd been investigating reports of Cherokee presence in the territory, following up on rumors that had filtered back to Washington through various unofficial channels. Morrison represented exactly the kind of threat that the Cherokee community most feared, possessing both the authority and the motivation to pursue forced relocation if he could locate and identify tribal refugees. Running Wolf had detected Morrison's presence in the territory several days before the agent reached the ranch, providing time to prepare responses to inquiries that might expose Cherokee secrets while appearing to cooperate with federal investigations. The advance warning had allowed Margaret to develop a cover story that explained any evidence of Native American presence around her property without revealing the existence of an organized Cherokee community. Morrison had arrived at the Triple S Ranch with the arrogant confidence of a federal official accustomed to intimidating frontier residents into compliance with government policies. His investigation focused on reports that Margaret Sullivan had received assistance from Indian allies during her battle with the rustling gang, information that suggested unauthorized Native American activity in an area that was supposed to be free of tribal presence. Mrs. Sullivan, Morrison had begun with bureaucratic formality. Federal records indicate that all Cherokee individuals in this territory were relocated to designated reservations more than a decade ago. However, we've received reports suggesting that you may have had contact with tribal members who avoided lawful relocation procedures. Margaret had responded with the careful mixture of truth and misdirection that she'd practiced for exactly this type of encounter. Agent Morrison, I've lived on this ranch for more than 15 years, and I've certainly encountered individual Indians during that time. This is a wild country, and all sorts of people pass through looking for work or just traveling somewhere else. The response had been technically accurate while avoiding any admission of ongoing relationships with Cherokee individuals or knowledge of organized tribal communities. Morrison had pressed for more specific information about Native American contacts, but Margaret had maintained her position that any such encounters had been brief and informal, rather than the kind of organized assistance that would indicate tribal presence. The federal agent had spent 2 days investigating the ranch and surrounding area, searching for evidence of Cherokee activity while questioning neighbors about their observations of unusual occurrences. Morrison's investigation had been thorough but ultimately unsuccessful, failing to uncover proof of tribal presence that would justify further federal intervention. The agent's departure had provided relief but also highlighted the ongoing vulnerability that the Cherokee community faced from federal policies designed to complete their cultural destruction through forced assimilation. Margaret understood that Morrison's investigation would be followed by others, requiring constant vigilance and careful management of any evidence that might expose Running Wolf's people to government attention. The spring season had also brought news from other territories about the fate of Cherokee communities that had been discovered by federal agents and subjected to forced relocation. The reports painted a grim picture of cultural destruction and human suffering that reinforced Margaret's determination to protect the band that had found refuge in the Montana wilderness. As summer approached, Margaret had found herself thinking more deeply about the long-term implications of her relationship with Running Wolf and the Cherokee community. The friendship that had begun beside Willow Creek more than 2 decades earlier had evolved into something approaching a political alliance, with responsibilities and risks that extended far beyond personal loyalty. The Triple S Ranch had become more than Margaret's home. It served as a buffer zone and intelligence gathering post that helped protect Cherokee security while providing early warning of potential threats. Margaret's growing reputation as a frontier legend created opportunities for gathering information about federal activities and territorial policies that might affect Native American communities throughout the region, but the arrangement also created ongoing vulnerabilities that required careful management to prevent catastrophic exposure. Margaret understood that maintaining the balance between protection and security would require wisdom, courage, and constant adaptation to changing circumstances. Standing on her porch as summer's warmth returned to the Montana landscape, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from vulnerable widow to trusted ally of a hidden Cherokee community. The transformation had required learning new skills, accepting unprecedented responsibilities, and embracing a vision of friendship that transcended the racial prejudices that poisoned much of frontier society. The legend of her victory over Jake Hendrick's gang would continue to grow and evolve, drawing visitors and attracting attention that could prove either beneficial or dangerous, depending on how it was managed. But the truth behind that legend, the story of cross-cultural friendship and mutual protection that had made the victory possible, would remain safely hidden, known only to those who'd lived it and proven themselves worthy of its trust. In the end, Margaret understood that the most important victories weren't those that made headlines or created legends, but those that preserved the bonds between people who'd chosen to stand together against whatever challenges the world might send. The Triple S Ranch had become a sanctuary where different worlds could meet safely, protected by friendship that had been tested in the crucible of violence and emerged stronger from every trial. The future would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but Margaret faced them with confidence born of experience and the knowledge that she would never fight alone. Blood brotherhood, proven in battle and strengthened by shared sacrifice, had created bonds that could weather any storm and overcome any enemy. As the sun set over the Montana wilderness, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reflected off the distant peaks, Margaret Sullivan knew that she'd found something rarer and more valuable than all the cattle and land and frontier fame combined. She discovered that true family transcended blood and culture, created through choice and sacrifice and the willingness to stand together when standing alone meant certain defeat. The legend would continue to grow, but the truth would endure forever. 2 years after the night that had transformed her life, Margaret found herself facing an entirely different kind of challenge that threatened to upend everything she'd built. A railroad company had announced plans to extend their line through the valley, bringing with it the promise of economic development and the certainty of dramatic change to the isolated world she'd come to treasure. The proposed route would pass within 3 miles of the Triple S Ranch, close enough to dramatically alter the character of the region while potentially exposing the Cherokee community to levels of scrutiny that could prove catastrophic. The railroad survey team had arrived in late summer, a collection of engineers, surveyors, and investors who moved through the territory with the confident authority of men who saw wilderness as an obstacle to be overcome, rather than a way of life to be preserved. Their leader, a portly man named Pemberton, who wore expensive Eastern clothing unsuited to frontier conditions, had made a point of visiting every significant landowner in the valley to discuss the opportunities that rail transportation would create. Mrs. Sullivan, Pemberton had announced during his visit to the ranch, "You're sitting on what will soon become some of the most valuable real estate in Montana Territory. Railroad access will transform this entire region, bringing markets for your cattle that you can't even imagine right now. A woman of your business acumen surely recognizes the extraordinary opportunities that technological progress creates." Margaret had listened to his presentation with the polite attention due a visitor, but every word had increased her apprehension about the changes that railroad development would bring to her carefully constructed life. Pemberton spoke of progress and prosperity, but Margaret understood that his vision of improvement would mean the end of the isolation that had protected both her independence and the Pamgwi Cherokee community's security. The railroad promoter had continued his pitch with the enthusiasm of a man selling dreams to investors. Within 5 years, this valley will have regular passenger service, freight connections to markets in Chicago and St. Louis, and telegraph communication with the civilized world. Your ranch will be worth 10 times its current value, assuming you have the vision to position yourself advantageously for the coming transformation. But Margaret had also heard the threats implicit in Pemberton's optimistic predictions. Railroad development would bring large numbers of workers during construction, followed by permanent settlements that would eliminate the wilderness buffer that currently protected Cherokee hideouts. Federal surveyors and territorial officials would map the region with unprecedented precision, making it impossible to maintain the secret locations that had sheltered Running Wolf's people for more than a decade. The railroad company had made preliminary offers to purchase right-of-way easements across several ranches, including a strip of land along Margaret's southern boundary that would provide the optimal route through the valley. The financial terms were generous, offering compensation that would make her genuinely wealthy while requiring her to surrender control over activities that could affect railroad operations. Margaret had requested time to consider the railroad's proposal, using the delay to consult with Running Wolf about the strategic implications of the development project. The Cherokee warrior had been studying the survey team's activities with the careful attention of someone who understood that small changes could have enormous consequences for his people's survival. "Railroad brings everything we've tried to avoid," Running Wolf had explained during one of their nighttime strategy sessions. Government officials, federal marshals, army patrols, land speculators, prospectors, settlers looking for new opportunities. Too many eyes watching too carefully for us to remain hidden. The Cherokee band had survived by maintaining perfect invisibility within a vast wilderness that provided countless hiding places for small groups of people who understood how to live without leaving obvious traces. But railroad development would transform that wilderness into surveyed, mapped, and regularly patrolled territory where unauthorized presence would be quickly detected and reported to appropriate authorities. Running Wolf had proposed several alternative responses to the railroad threat, ranging from relocating the Cherokee community to more remote territory to actively sabotaging the survey operations in hopes of discouraging the development project. Each option carried significant risks and uncertain prospects for success, while doing nothing would virtually guarantee exposure when construction activities brought hundreds of workers into the area. Margaret had found herself caught between competing loyalties and conflicting visions of the future. The railroad development offered legitimate opportunities for economic advancement and integration with the broader territorial economy that was rapidly modernizing throughout the American West, but accepting those opportunities would mean abandoning the Cherokee community that had become her chosen family and destroying relationships that had given her life meaning beyond mere survival. The internal conflict had been complicated by pressure from neighbors who saw railroad development as the key to regional prosperity and couldn't understand Margaret's apparent reluctance to embrace obvious progress. Pete Carlson and other local ranchers had formed a development committee to coordinate negotiations with the railroad company, and they expected Margaret's participation based on her reputation as one of the most successful operators in the valley. "Don't understand your hesitation, Margaret," Carlson had said during the community meeting to discuss railroad negotiations. "This is the opportunity we've all been waiting for, the chance to connect with markets that will make us all rich. Why would you want to stay isolated when the whole world is opening up to us?" Margaret had struggled to explain her reservations, without revealing the true source of her concerns about increased development and government presence in the area. Her neighbors interpreted her caution as feminine timidity or irrational attachment to frontier isolation, not understanding the complex web of relationships and responsibilities that made railroad development a threat rather than an opportunity. The pressure had intensified when Captain Reynolds had renewed his courtship campaign, arguing that marriage to him would provide the masculine guidance necessary for navigating the complex business decisions that railroad development would require. The former cavalry officer had positioned himself as an expert on territorial development, claiming connections with railroad officials and government authorities that could prove valuable for protecting her interests. "This is no time for a woman to be making decisions alone," Reynolds had argued with military directness. "Railroad negotiations require political connections and business experience that you simply don't possess. Together, we could position ourselves to profit enormously from the coming changes while ensuring that your property interests are properly protected." Margaret had rejected his renewed proposals with the same firmness she'd shown during his previous attempts, but Reynolds had become more persistent as the stakes of railroad development became clear. The captain had begun suggesting that a woman who refused masculine guidance might find herself disadvantaged in negotiations with sophisticated Eastern businessmen who wouldn't respect feminine decision-making. The implicit threats in Reynolds' approach had prompted deeper conversations with Running Wolf about the political dimensions of the challenges they faced. The Cherokee warrior had experience dealing with white officials who used a combination of bribery, intimidation, and legal manipulation to achieve their objectives, and he recognized similar patterns in the railroad company's development strategy. They used pressure from multiple directions, Running Wolf had observed. Economic incentives, social expectations, political connections, legal requirements make it impossible to refuse their offers without facing consequences that are worse than accepting. "We need to find ways to disrupt their strategy without exposing ourselves to retaliation." The Cherokee approach to resistance had always emphasized patience, indirection, and the use of opponents' assumptions against them. Rather than confronting superior force directly, Running Wolf's people had learned to create confusion, misdirection, and delay that made their enemies' objectives more difficult to achieve while avoiding open conflict that could provoke overwhelming retaliation. Margaret had begun applying Cherokee resistance strategies to her dealings with the railroad company, using her reputation for feminine independence to justify delays and requests for additional information that complicated their development timeline. Her refusal to make quick decisions had frustrated railroad officials who expected frontier landowners to eagerly embrace opportunities for economic advancement. The delay tactics had provided time for more thorough investigation of the railroad, company's financial backing and political connections, research that revealed disturbing information about their business practices in other territories. Running Wolf had used his intelligence network to gather information about previous railroad projects, discovering patterns of fraud, environmental destruction, and broken promises that characterized the company's approach to development. They promise prosperity but deliver exploitation, Running Wolf had reported after weeks of careful investigation. Other communities thought railroad would bring wealth and progress. Instead, they got debt, pollution, and loss of control over their own land. Company takes profits while local people pay the costs. The intelligence about railroad company practices had provided Margaret with additional justification for resisting their development project, but it had also highlighted the limited options available for preventing construction if the company obtained sufficient support from other landowners and territorial authorities. Individual resistance would likely prove futile against the combined political and economic power that the railroad could mobilize. Margaret had begun exploring alternative strategies that might preserve Cherokee security while accommodating some level of development in the region. The approach required careful analysis of the railroad's actual requirements versus their preferred options, looking for ways to modify the development project that would reduce its impact on sensitive areas while still providing the transportation connections that territorial officials demanded. The research had revealed that the railroad's proposed route through the valley was based on convenience rather than engineering necessity, chosen primarily because it avoided more difficult terrain. In adjacent areas, alternative routes existed that would serve the company's transportation objectives while passing through regions that contained no Cherokee settlements or sacred sites. Working with Running Wolf's detailed knowledge of regional geography, Margaret had developed a counter-proposal that would redirect the railroad through a parallel valley 20 miles to the south, where construction would be more expensive, but would avoid the sensitive areas that contained Cherokee winter camps and traditional gathering places. The alternative route would still provide rail access to the region while preserving the wilderness buffer that protected Cherokee security. Presenting the counter-proposal had required careful political maneuvering to avoid revealing the true motivations behind Margaret's preference for the alternative route. She had framed her arguments in terms of environmental protection and concern about railroad impacts on livestock operations, emphasizing practical considerations that territorial officials would understand and respect. The proposed route passes directly through some of the finest grazing land in the territory, Margaret had argued during a territorial development meeting. Railroad construction and operations would disrupt cattle movements and reduce the productivity of ranches that represent significant investments in regional agriculture. The alternative route would serve transportation needs while preserving agricultural resources that contribute to territorial prosperity. The environmental arguments had gained unexpected support from other ranchers, who were beginning to understand the potential negative impacts of railroad development on their operations. Cattle didn't respect railroad schedules, and the noise and disruption of regular train traffic could significantly complicate livestock management throughout the valley. Margaret's advocacy for the alternative route had also attracted support from territorial officials who were concerned about maintaining political relationships with established ranchers while accommodating railroad development pressures. The compromise solution offered a way to satisfy both constituencies while avoiding the kind of political conflict that could complicate future development projects. But the railroad company had resisted the alternative route proposal, arguing that the additional construction costs would make their project financially unviable while delaying completion by at least 2 years. Company officials had increased their pressure on individual landowners, offering enhanced compensation packages while threatening to use territorial eminent domain authority to acquire necessary easements without voluntary agreements. The escalating conflict had attracted attention from territorial newspapers, which had begun covering the railroad development controversy as a symbol of broader tensions between traditional frontier society and modernizing economic forces. Margaret's role as a prominent advocate for the alternative route had brought renewed publicity that further complicated her efforts to maintain the low profile necessary for protecting Cherokee interests. Eastern newspapers had picked up the story as another example of frontier resistance to progress and modernization, portraying Margaret as either a heroic defender of environmental values or a stubborn obstacle to economic development, depending on their editorial perspective. The renewed media attention had brought additional visitors to the Triple S Ranch, including reporters seeking interviews about her opposition to railroad development. Margaret had declined all media interviews, while continuing to advocate for the alternative route through official territorial channels, but the publicity had made her position increasingly difficult to maintain. Railroad supporters had begun questioning whether a woman who'd gained fame through violence was qualified to make decisions about regional development, while environmental advocates had tried to recruit her for broader campaigns against industrial development throughout the territory. The political complexity of the situation had required increasingly sophisticated coordination with Running Wolf and the Cherokee Leadership Council, as decisions about railroad resistance would affect the entire community's long-term survival strategy. The Cherokee Band had maintained their security through decades of careful invisibility, but the railroad controversy threatened to expose them to levels of scrutiny that could force immediate relocation after months of political maneuvering and public advocacy. Margaret had achieved a partial victory when territorial officials had agreed to require the railroad company to conduct comprehensive environmental impact studies before proceeding with construction. The studies would delay the project by at least a year while providing additional opportunities to advocate for the alternative route that would preserve Cherokee security. But Margaret understood that the delay was temporary rather than permanent, and that ultimate success would require either convincing the railroad company to accept the alternative route or finding ways to make their preferred route politically or financially impossible to implement. The campaign would need sustained effort over several years, requiring resources and political connections that went far beyond what she could provide individually. Standing on her porch as autumn returned to the Montana landscape, Margaret reflected on how much her life had changed since the night Jake Hendricks had tried to steal her cattle. The simple widow defending her ranch had evolved into a political advocate fighting for environmental protection and indigenous rights, using skills and knowledge she'd never expected to need. The railroad controversy had taught her valuable lessons about the interconnected nature of frontier politics and the ways that individual actions could have consequences extending far beyond their immediate circumstances. Her friendship with Running Wolf had grown into a political alliance that influenced territorial development policies while protecting vulnerable communities from government persecution. But the future remained uncertain, with new challenges emerging as rapidly as old ones were resolved. The railroad company would eventually overcome current obstacles through superior resources and political connections, requiring constant adaptation and innovation to maintain Cherokee security in an increasingly complex political environment. Margaret knew that the battle for her valley was far from over, but she also understood that she would never fight alone. The blood brotherhood forged beside Willow Creek had grown into something approaching a political movement with implications extending throughout the territory and beyond. The legend of the widow warrior had become a symbol of resistance to forces that threatened traditional ways of life. But the reality was more complex and more important than any legend. Margaret Sullivan had become a bridge between worlds, using her unique position to protect those who couldn't protect themselves while advocating for values that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. As winter approached once again, Margaret prepared for the long campaign ahead, knowing that preserving the life she'd built would require courage, wisdom, and determination that went far beyond what she'd needed to defeat a gang of rustlers. The real battle was just beginning, but she faced it with confidence born of experience and the knowledge that some fights were worth whatever they might cost. The turning point came from an unexpected source, when a young Cherokee woman named Silver Moon arrived at the ranch during the first blizzard of winter, traveling alone through conditions that would have killed most experienced frontiersmen. Margaret found her collapsed near the barn at dawn, half frozen and clutching a leather pouch that contained documents more explosive than any ammunition Hendrick's gang had ever carried. Silver Moon was running Wolf's niece, a woman of 25, who had been educated at a government boarding school before escaping and making her way back to Cherokee territory. Her education had provided her with skills that proved invaluable for intelligence gathering, as she could read and write English fluently while maintaining perfect fluency in Cherokee and several other tribal languages. For the past 3 years, she had been working as a domestic servant in the territorial capital, positioning herself to observe government activities while sending information back to hidden Cherokee communities. The documents Silver Moon carried contained correspondence between territorial officials and railroad executives that revealed the true scope of the development conspiracy. The railroad project was only the beginning of a much larger plan to exploit the region's natural resources, including timber harvesting, mineral extraction, and large-scale agriculture that would transform the entire valley into an industrial complex. "They've been planning this for 5 years, Silver Moon explained when she'd recovered enough to speak coherently. "The railroad is just the first step. Once they have transportation access, they'll bring in mining equipment to extract copper, deposits in the mountains, logging operations to clear-cut the forests, and agricultural machinery to convert grazing land into wheat farms." Margaret studied the stolen documents with growing alarm, recognizing that the environmental and cultural destruction they described would be irreversible once implemented. The development plan called for bringing thousands of workers into the region, establishing permanent settlements at strategic locations, and creating industrial infrastructure that would eliminate any possibility of maintaining Cherokee communities in their traditional territories. The correspondence also revealed that territorial officials had been secretly negotiating with federal authorities to provide military protection for the development projects, including the establishment of a permanent army garrison that would ensure compliance with government policies while suppressing any resistance from displaced Native American populations. "Fort McKenzie will be reactivated with 2 companies of cavalry," Silver Moon reported, translating from a document written in bureaucratic language designed to obscure its implications. "Their mission includes pacification of hostile elements that might interfere with lawful territorial development and final resolution of the Indian problem in the northern wilderness areas." The military component of the development plan represented an existential threat to every Cherokee community in the territory, as cavalry patrols would systematically search the wilderness areas that had provided refuge for more than a decade. The soldiers would have explicit orders to locate and arrest any Native Americans found outside designated reservations, regardless of whether they had committed any crimes or posed any actual threats to public safety. Margaret understood that the railroad controversy had been a distraction from the real threat, designed to focus opposition on a single development project, while concealing the broader conspiracy to militarize and industrialize the entire region. The environmental arguments that had seemed so compelling during territorial meetings were irrelevant when compared to the scale of destruction that the complete development plan would create. Running Wolf arrived at the ranch within hours of Silver Moon's report, having detected her approach through the intelligence network that monitored all movement in the valley. The Cherokee warrior's expression reflected the gravity of the situation as he reviewed the stolen documents, understanding immediately that his people faced the most serious threat to their survival since the original government relocation campaigns. We have perhaps 6 months before the first military patrols begin searching the mountains, Running Wolf assessed after studying the correspondence. The development timeline shows railroad construction starting in spring, with the Army garrison being established by midsummer. Once soldiers are actively patrolling, hiding becomes impossible. The Cherokee Leadership Council convened in an emergency session to consider their response options, meeting in a hidden cave system that Silver Moon had helped identify during her intelligence gathering activities. Margaret attended the council. Meeting as an honorary member, her status as Running Wolf's blood sister now extended to include formal recognition as a tribal ally with voice in strategic decisions. The council debate revealed fundamental disagreements about how to respond to the existential threat that territorial development represented. Elder members argued for immediate relocation to more remote territories where Cherokee communities might find temporary safety, while younger warriors advocated for armed resistance that could disrupt development projects and discourage further encroachment on traditional lands. Grandmother Willow presented a third alternative that combined elements of both strategies while introducing new possibilities that neither faction had considered. The medicine woman proposed creating formal legal challenges to the development projects, using Silver Moon's education and Margaret's political connections to fight the conspiracy through territorial courts and federal agencies. White man's law contains protections for indigenous peoples, Grandmother Willow explained. Government treaties promise that Cherokee people have rights to traditional territories, even if those treaties have been violated. Silver Moon learned about legal procedures during her education. Margaret has political connections that could help us access territorial courts. We fight them with their own weapons instead of retreating or starting wars we cannot win. The legal strategy represented a radical departure from traditional Cherokee approaches to conflict resolution, which emphasized negotiation, consensus building, and spiritual intervention rather than formal litigation. But the unprecedented nature of the threats they faced required unprecedented responses that drew on all available resources, including knowledge gained through forced interaction with white educational and political systems. Silver Moon's boarding school education had included legal studies that she could adapt for defending Cherokee rights, while Margaret's political advocacy during the railroad controversy had created relationships with territorial officials who might support indigenous legal claims. The combination of legal knowledge, political connections, and documented evidence of government corruption created opportunities for challenging the development conspiracy through official channels, but pursuing legal remedies would require Cherokee representatives to emerge from hiding and formally present themselves to territorial authorities, a strategy that carried enormous risks if the legal challenges proved unsuccessful. Once Cherokee communities revealed their locations and membership to government officials, retreat to traditional invisibility would become impossible. The council debate continued for 3 days, with each faction presenting detailed arguments about the advantages and disadvantages of their preferred strategies. Margaret contributed her perspective on territorial politics and the likelihood that various approaches would succeed, while Silver Moon provided intelligence about government planning that influenced assessments of different tactical options. The final decision reflected characteristic Cherokee consensus building, with elements from all proposed strategies combined into a comprehensive response plan. The community would pursue legal challenges while simultaneously preparing for potential relocation and organizing limited resistance activities that could disrupt development projects without triggering massive military retaliation. Margaret's role in the plan involved using her political connections to introduce formal legal challenges while maintaining her public advocacy for environmental protection that would provide cover for more sensitive Cherokee legal activities. Silver Moon would return to the territorial capital to continue intelligence gathering while coordinating with sympathetic legal professionals who might assist with indigenous rights cases. Running Wolf would lead a covert operations group responsible for gathering evidence of government corruption and corporate fraud that could strengthen legal challenges while conducting limited sabotage against development projects if legal remedies proved inadequate. The strategy balanced offensive and defensive approaches while maintaining flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. The legal campaign began with Margaret filing formal objections to the railroad development project, citing previously unknown environmental regulations that required more comprehensive impact studies before construction could proceed. The objections were based on research that Silver Moon had conducted in territorial legal archives, identifying forgotten laws that still carried binding authority. Despite being ignored by current officials, the environmental objections forced territorial courts to schedule formal hearings where evidence about development impacts could be presented publicly, creating opportunities to introduce information about broader corruption and fraud that characterized the entire development. Conspiracy. Margaret's reputation as a frontier legend ensured significant media attention for the court proceedings, providing a platform for exposing government misconduct to territorial voters. Silver Moon's intelligence gathering had identified specific instances of bribery, fraud, and abuse of authority that could be documented through government records and witness testimony. The evidence showed that territorial officials had accepted substantial payments from railroad and mining companies in exchange for approving development projects without conducting required environmental and cultural impact assessments. The corruption revelations created political scandals that disrupted the development timeline, while generating public support for more careful regulation of industrial projects throughout the territory. Margaret's environmental advocacy gained credibility as investigations revealed the extent to which corporate interests had been manipulating government policies for private gain. But the legal victories were temporary and incomplete, with powerful corporate interests working to overcome judicial obstacles through political pressure and expanded bribery campaigns. The development conspiracy had access to financial resources that dwarfed anything that Cherokee communities could mobilize, and they were prepared to sustain legal battles for years while continuing construction activities wherever possible. Incomplete nature of legal remedies prompted Running Wolf's covert operations group to begin more direct forms of resistance, including sabotage activities that disrupted surveying operations and damaged equipment while avoiding casualties that might justify military intervention. The Cherokee warriors drew on traditional skills adapted for modern conditions, using knowledge of explosives and mechanical systems that some had acquired during military service in territorial conflicts. The sabotage campaign was carefully designed to appear as random vandalism rather than organized resistance, with operations conducted across multiple locations to prevent authorities from identifying patterns that might indicate coordinated Cherokee involvement. Running Wolf's group targeted surveying equipment, temporary bridges, supply caches, and communication lines while avoiding any actions that might harm individual workers or civilians. The mysterious equipment failures and construction delays created additional costs for development companies, while reinforcing legal arguments about the inadequate planning that characterized their projects. Corporate executives blamed the problems on incompetent contractors and adverse weather conditions, never suspecting that they were facing organized resistance from supposedly non-existent Cherokee communities. Margaret's position as a public advocate provided perfect cover for coordinating between legal and covert resistance activities, as her ranch served as a communication center where information could be exchanged without creating suspicious patterns of contact between Cherokee operatives and legal representatives. Her political connections enabled her to gather intelligence about government responses to the sabotage campaign while providing early warning of potential crackdowns on resistance activities. As spring approached, and the development projects prepared to resume active construction, the combined legal and covert resistance had succeeded in delaying the industrial transformation of the valley, while exposing government corruption that had influenced territorial elections. But Margaret understood that ultimate victory would require either convincing corporate interests that the region was too problematic for profitable development, or finding ways to provide permanent legal protection for Cherokee communities and traditional territories. The campaign had transformed her from an individual rancher defending her property into the public face of a broader movement that challenged corporate colonization of the American West. Her frontier legend had evolved into political symbolism that represented resistance to forces that threatened traditional ways of life throughout the territory. Standing on her porch as another spring returned to the Montana wilderness, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from vulnerable widow to political revolutionary in less than 3 years. The simple act of defending her cattle had created ripple effects that now influenced territorial politics while protecting indigenous communities from cultural extinction. The battle for the valley had become a symbol of larger conflicts between corporate exploitation and environmental protection, between federal authority and local autonomy, between industrial development and traditional culture. Margaret's role in that battle had grown far beyond anything she could have imagined when she'd first pulled the trigger against Jake Hendrick's gang, but the personal relationships that had motivated her original actions remained the foundation of everything she'd accomplished. Blood brotherhood with Running Wolf had created obligations that extended throughout Cherokee society, while her commitment to protecting vulnerable communities had expanded to include environmental and political advocacy that benefited everyone who valued wilderness over industrial development. The future remained uncertain, with new challenges emerging as rapidly as old ones were resolved. But Margaret faced whatever might come with confidence, born of experience and the knowledge that individual courage, properly directed and strategically applied, could influence events far beyond its apparent limitations. The legend that had begun with a single night of violence had grown into something approaching a political movement. But the truth behind that legend remained more powerful than any myth. Margaret Sullivan had discovered that the most important victories weren't those that made headlines, but those that preserved the bonds between people who chose to stand together against forces that threatened everything they valued. As the sun set over the Montana wilderness, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Margaret knew that her story was far from finished. The ranch that had once represented simple survival had become the headquarters of resistance activities that would determine the future of an entire region, while the friendship that had begun beside Willow Creek had evolved into a political alliance that challenged some of the most powerful interests in territorial society. The woman who had once fought alone against cattle rustlers now commanded resources and support that spanned multiple communities and extended throughout the territorial political system. But she had never forgotten the lesson learned during that first violent night. Blood brotherhood meant never fighting alone, and the strongest bonds were those forged in the crucible of shared struggle against overwhelming odds. The legend would continue to grow and evolve, but the truth that gave it meaning would endure as long as people remembered that courage, loyalty, and determination could overcome any challenge when properly combined and strategically applied. Margaret Sullivan had become proof that individual actions, however small they might seem, could change the world when guided by principles worth defending and supported by friendships worth any sacrifice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.